The strangest thing about the ancient world is that it keeps becoming more mysterious, not less. You would expect thousands of years of exploration to leave us with fewer questions. Instead, the opposite has happened. Every excavation uncovers another puzzle. Every new technology reveals details no one knew existed. Places once thought to be fully understood suddenly reveal hidden chambers, forgotten structures, or evidence that challenges long-held beliefs. It is as if the ancient world reveals only enough to convince us we're getting closer, before exposing an even deeper mystery beneath it. That is what makes these places so extraordinary. They are not simply reminders of the past. They are living investigations, quietly waiting for the next discovery to change everything we thought we knew. Stone should crack here, mortar should fail. Structures built on this exposed plateau, where temperature swings can exceed 40 degrees Celsius between seasons, should not remain coherent for 2 millennia. And yet, at Porolissum, they do, quietly defying the expected limits of Roman engineering. Porolissum was first systematically identified in the 19th century, with early excavations beginning in the late 1800s under Austro-Hungarian administration, and later expanded in the 20th century by Romanian archaeologists who uncovered fortifications, gates, roads, and an amphitheatre, with each excavation phase revealing not a single anomaly, but a repeating pattern of engineering decisions that seemed optimized far beyond what their time should have allowed. Porolissum sits along the northern frontier of the Roman Empire as part of the defensive limes, and unlike iconic urban centres such as Pompeii or the rigid geometric grid of Timgad, it was never built as a showcase city, but instead functioned as a control node, exposed, functional and vulnerable, which makes the level of engineering integration found here far more difficult to explain, because every component appears to operate not independently, but as part of a unified system. The primary entrance at Porolissum is not aligned along a straight axis, but instead forces entrance through a sequence of angled passages, narrow corridors, and staggered walls, where reconstructed measurements show angular deviations between wall segments of approximately 10 to 15 degrees repeated with remarkable consistency. And in modern crowd dynamics, such geometry is known to reduce movement speed and increase controllability without direct enforcement by creating behavioral friction, as individuals naturally slow when navigating constrained, non-linear paths. What makes this particularly striking is that this effect is typically modeled only in 21st century studies of crowd behavior, yet no surviving Roman text describes such a system in theoretical terms. And although similar ideas appear later in medieval fortifications, with deliberately engineered choke points and controlled zones, Porolissum predates those developments by centuries, raising an unresolved question of whether this design emerged purely from repeated empirical experimentation or reflects an intuitive understanding of flow control principles that would not be formally described mathematically for nearly 2,000 years. The internal road system of Porolissum reveals another layer of complexity, where despite being built on uneven and elevated terrain, gradients are maintained within a narrow range, with archaeological surveys indicating slopes rarely exceeding 8 to 10%, closely matching what modern civil engineering considers optimal for sustained movement. A fact that becomes even more unusual when considering the absence of accurate large-scale topographic mapping tools. While many pathways do not follow straight lines but instead curve with the terrain, while maintaining nearly consistent radii over long distances, implying not only local adaptation but also a form of continuous spatial awareness. And when compared to Pompeii, where streets follow a grid imposed on relatively flat ground, or Timgad, where strict orthogonal planning reflects geometric rigidity. Porolissum behaves as a flexible system that adapts dynamically to its environment, as if guided by a comprehensive terrain model that should not have been possible with second-century surveying capabilities. Surrounding Porolissum is a network of elevated observation points, including hills, towers, and natural ridges integrated into a broader defensive system. And when analyzed spatially, these points form overlapping lines of sight where each node maintains direct visual connection with at least two others, with distances falling within effective ranges for signal transmission, likely using fire or smoke, thereby creating redundancy in communication, so that if one point fails, signals can still be transmitted through alternate paths, a principle that mirrors modern network systems where overlapping coverage ensures resilience and fault tolerance. And although the Roman use of signaling systems is well documented, the level of distribution and optimization in this network exceeds minimal functional requirements, suggesting it may not be merely a tactical solution, but an early manifestation of distributed systems thinking that has yet to be fully understood. This is where Porolissum becomes most difficult to explain, because the region experiences significant thermal variation with freezing winters and hot summers, conditions that typically cause stone to expand and contract cyclically, placing stress on structural bonds and generating microfractures that accumulate over time. In most ancient constructions, this leads to visible structural degradation within a few centuries. Yet at Porolissum, many wall segments remain structurally coherent after nearly 2,000 years, and analysis of surviving mortar samples reveals a non-uniform composition with variations in aggregate size, lime ratios, and indications of locally sourced minerals mixed into the material, which at first appears uncontrolled but aligns with a principle recognized in modern materials science, where heterogeneous structures are more effective at distributing stress, interrupting crack propagation pathways, and reducing the likelihood of catastrophic failure, while uneven thermal expansion between components allows energy absorption rather than stress concentration at single nacort, creating a more resilient system than a uniform material. This produces a paradox because standard Roman concrete, such as opus caementicium, was already highly advanced, especially in marine environments, yet the formulation used at Porolissum does not fully match standard recipes, and instead appears deliberately adapted to local environmental conditions. And when compared to structures such as Hadrian's Wall, where similar climatic stress has led to clear long-term deterioration, Porolissum shows segments with significantly higher cohesion, further supported by evidence of stratified foundations in certain areas where alternating material layers may have functioned as primitive shock absorbers against ground movement and freeze-thaw cycles, closely resembling modern geotechnical engineering strategies, despite the complete absence of any surviving documentation explaining these methods, leaving open the question of whether such techniques were the result of prolonged empirical refinement or evidence of a systematic understanding of material behavior and environmental interaction that has since been lost. Individually, each feature of Porolissum can be explained by known Roman engineering, but together the site functions as a coordinated system where gates regulate movement, roads optimize terrain, observation points form a resilient network, and materials adapt to environmental stress, creating an integrated design that appears deliberately calculated, yet without any surviving blueprint, written theory, or clear developmental stages. Porolissum seems to emerge fully formed at the edge of an empire. What if Porolissum is not an isolated anomaly, but evidence of a deeper layer of ancient engineering logic that we are only beginning to recognize? Cabezo Redondo is not supposed to function the way it does. Located near modern Villena in southeastern Spain, This hilltop settlement dates to approximately 2000 to 1200 BCE. Within the Iberian Bronze Age, a period typically defined by small, loosely organized communities still experimenting with early forms of social complexity. Yet from the moment it is examined in detail, Cabezo Redondo resists that classification. It appears structured, controlled, and internally coordinated at a level that does not align with its time. Excavations carried out throughout the 20th century revealed a densely compressed settlement built across a naturally defensive elevation. The architectural layout is not random. Houses are tightly interlocked, sharing walls and minimizing unused space. Movement is channeled through narrow, deliberate pathways. This is not organic expansion. It resembles a system under constraint, as if spatial efficiency was not a byproduct, but a governing principle. Compared to other Iberian Bronze Age sites, particularly the dispersed rural settlements across central Spain, Cabezo Redondo behaves less like a village and more like an early compact urban mechanism. The anomaly intensifies when storage systems are considered. Archaeologists uncovered numerous silos and embedded storage pits integrated directly into domestic structures. Their combined capacity exceeds what would be expected for a subsistence-level population. Estimates indicate volumes sufficient either to sustain a significantly larger population than the settlement likely contained, or to maintain reserves far beyond seasonal necessity. This is not casual surplus. It implies intentional accumulation, long-term planning, and controlled distribution, which leads to the central problem: control without visibility. No palatial structures have been identified. There are no monumental administrative buildings, no centralized complexes that would indicate a ruling authority in material form. In contemporaneous sites such as Mycenae, we observe massive fortifications, formalized elite spaces, and unmistakable symbols of hierarchy. Cabezo Redondo presents none of these. And yet, the internal logic of the settlement suggests that hierarchy must have existed. Certain dwellings are larger and more complex, implying social differentiation. Storage appears unevenly distributed, implying selective access. The system operates like a managed economy, but without exposing the mechanism that manages it. Material culture reinforces the contradiction. The inhabitants clearly possessed bronze working capabilities, a technology dependent on both technical knowledge and access to trade networks for copper and tin. While parts of Iberia provide certain metal resources, the full metallurgical process requires connections beyond the immediate environment. This suggests participation in regional or even long-distance exchange systems. However, the scale of coordination implied by the settlement's organization exceeds what is typically supported by evidence of such networks in this region during the same period. Once again, the internal complexity of the system outpaces its external context. Nearby, another discovery complicates the picture further: the Villena treasure. This hoard, consisting of nearly 10 kilograms of gold along with silver and early iron objects, is one of the most significant Bronze Age finds in Western Europe. The craftsmanship is precise. The quantity is extraordinary. Yet within Cabezo Redondo itself, there is no equivalent display of wealth, no elite tombs filled with gold, no ceremonial architecture designed to exhibit power. The wealth exists, but it is disconnected from visibility. This creates a second layer of contradiction. In most early complex societies, wealth is transformed into display. It legitimizes authority, reinforces hierarchy, and communicates dominance across social layers. At Cabezo Redondo, wealth appears to have been removed from this equation. It is accumulated, but not exhibited, controlled, but not declared. The system does not signal power in the ways we expect. Architecturally, the settlement reflects a form of intelligence that is subtle but effective. Construction relies on stone and mud brick, materials used with an efficiency that maximizes thermal regulation and structural stability. The design integrates seamlessly with the terrain, reducing the need for large-scale defensive construction while maintaining security. This is not technological limitation, it is optimization. Yet the tools recovered from the site do not fully explain the precision of spatial organization achieved. The knowledge existed, the process remains partially obscured. Population estimates suggest a few hundred inhabitants at peak occupation. Statistically, this is significant. Anthropological models indicate that such a population size typically does not require nor sustain the level of organizational complexity observed here without either strong centralized authority or a much larger demographic base. Cabezo Redondo fits neither model cleanly. It is too small to demand such coordination, yet too coordinated to arise spontaneously. Time introduces the final disruption. The settlement remained active for several centuries. There is no clear evidence of catastrophic destruction, no widespread burn layers, no mass graves indicative of conflict, no abrupt abandonment horizon. Instead, occupation appears to diminish gradually. Activity declines, structural coherence weakens, and eventually, the system ceases to exist. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply discontinued. This pattern diverges from better documented collapses. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, late Bronze Age sites frequently display clear destruction layers associated with systemic collapse around 1200 BCE. Cabezo Redondo does not conform to this pattern. Its disappearance appears internal, slow, and unforced. What remains is not a typical settlement, but a functional anomaly, a community that demonstrates controlled resource management, spatial precision, and social differentiation without the visible frameworks that usually support such features. It behaves like a system governed by principles that are only partially preserved in the archaeological record. One interpretation suggests that Cabezo Redondo represents an early form of centralized economic control authority, embedded not in monuments, but in access to storage and distribution. Another proposes that social cohesion and shared cultural norms replace the need for overt displays of power, creating a stable equilibrium that left minimal physical evidence. Both interpretations attempt to reconcile the data. Neither fully resolves it. A more unsettling possibility remains. Cabezo Redondo may represent a configuration of human organization that does not align with established models of social evolution. A system that functioned efficiently within its own constraints, but did not expand, replicate, or leave a clear developmental legacy. Not an early step toward later civilizations, but a parallel formation, one that emerged, stabilized, and then ended without continuation. Because the central issue is not the absence of information, it is the behavior of the information we possess. The settlement is too organized for its scale, too controlled for its visibility, and too coherent for its historical position. It does not follow the expected trajectory of complexity. Cabezo Redondo does not revise history. It exposes the possibility that history itself is incomplete. Hidden within the desolate expanse of the Great Basin in western Nevada, Spirit Cave stands as one of the most quietly disruptive archaeological sites in North America, a place where fragile strands of plant fiber challenge everything we thought we understood about prehistoric technology. First excavated in 1940 by Sidney M. Wheeler, the cave initially gained attention for the discovery of a remarkably well-preserved human mummy, later dated to approximately 10,600 years before present through radiocarbon analysis. Yet as subsequent expeditions revisited the site, particularly in the 1970s with improved stratigraphic methods, in the 1990s with refined carbon dating, and again in the 2010s using advanced material analysis, the true significance of Spirit Cave began to shift away from the human remains themselves and towards something far more subtle, yet arguably more profound: the textiles, sandals, and woven artifacts that accompanied them. These items, crafted from processed sagebrush bark and other native plant fibers, have been dated to roughly the same period, placing them among the oldest surviving examples of fiber technology in the Americas and possibly the world. What makes them extraordinary is not merely their age, but the level of technical precision embedded in their construction, a precision that seems almost anachronistic when placed within the broader context of early Holocene hunter-gatherer societies. The sandals recovered from the cave, for instance, are constructed using a sophisticated twining technique in which two or more weft elements are systematically twisted around a series of warp elements, creating a flexible yet highly durable structure. Microscopic analysis has revealed that the fibers were not randomly assembled but processed to achieve consistent thickness and tensile strength, with twist angles maintained at near uniform degrees across entire sections of the weave. In some cases, the spacing between strands remains consistent within a fraction of a millimeter, suggesting not only skilled craftsmanship, but an internalized standard of production, something closer to an unwritten engineering protocol than ad hoc experimentation. Experimental reconstructions conducted by modern researchers have demonstrated that reproducing these sandals using only primitive tools requires dozens of hours of labor and a deep familiarity with the mechanical behavior of plant fibers, including their response to moisture, tension, and repeated stress. When compared to early textile traditions in other parts of the world, the implications become even more striking. At sites like Çatalhöyük, widely regarded as one of the earlier centers of complex human settlement, evidence of woven textiles appears around 7000 BCE, several millennia after the Spirit Cave artifacts, yet often in less structurally refined forms. Similarly, early Neolithic sites in the Levant and Mesopotamia show the gradual emergence of weaving technologies alongside the development of agriculture and sedentary life, reinforcing the long-held assumption that complex textile production is a byproduct of stable, resource-rich societies. Spirit Cave, however, disrupts this narrative entirely. Here, in a harsh, resource-scarce desert environment inhabited by mobile hunter-gatherers, we find fiber technologies that not only rival, but in some respects exceed those of later agricultural communities. This raises a fundamental question. How did such a high level of material engineering emerge in a context where, according to conventional models, it should not exist? The answer may lie in the unique environmental pressures of the Great Basin. With extreme temperature fluctuations, near limited water sources, and a landscape that offers little margin for error, survival would have depended on tools and materials that were both lightweight and exceptionally durable. In this context, the development of advanced fiber technologies may represent a form of adaptive innovation, a response to environmental constraints that drove experimentation and refinement over countless generations. Yet even this explanation falls short of accounting for the apparent standardization observed in the artifacts. The repeated patterns, consistent techniques, and uniform quality suggest not isolated ingenuity, but a shared body of knowledge, transmitted and preserved within the community with remarkable fidelity. Without written language, this transmission would have relied on oral instruction and hands-on apprenticeship, raising the possibility that prehistoric societies possessed far more sophisticated systems of knowledge preservation than we typically acknowledge. Further complicating the picture is the role these textiles may have played beyond mere utility. The Spirit Cave mummy itself was found wrapped in layers of woven material arranged in a manner that appears deliberate rather than incidental. Some researchers have proposed that these wrappings were designed not only for cultural or ritual purposes, but also to regulate the microenvironment around the body, controlling airflow, reducing moisture, and inhibiting microbial activity. If true, this would imply an empirical understanding of how organic materials interact with environmental conditions, effectively representing an early form of biomaterial engineering. And such a possibility is supported by the exceptional state of preservation observed in both the mummy and the associated artifacts, which show minimal signs of decay despite their immense age. Modern analytical techniques, including scanning, electron microscopy, and chemical residue analysis, have begun to explore whether the fibers were treated with natural compounds, such as plant resins or ash solutions, to enhance their durability or resistance to pests. While definitive conclusions remain elusive, preliminary findings suggest that at least some level of material processing may have been involved, hinting at a proto-chemical approach to textile production. When viewed in this light, the artifacts of Spirit Cave are no longer simple remnants of daily life, but components of a broader technological system, one that integrates material science, environmental adaptation, and cultural practice into a cohesive whole. And yet, perhaps the most perplexing aspect of this system is its apparent disappearance. Despite the sophistication evident in the Spirit Cave materials, similar techniques do not appear to persist in a continuous, traceable lineage within the archaeological record of North America. Later cultures in the region exhibit their own forms of fiber technology, but often with different methods, materials, and levels of refinement, suggesting either a loss of knowledge or a transformation so complete that its origins become unrecognizable. Yet this discontinuity challenges the idea that technology evolves in a straight line, suggesting that entire bodies of ancient knowledge may have emerged and disappeared without leaving clear traces. Spirit Cave therefore acts both as a window into the past and a warning that what archaeology preserves is only a small fragment of true history. The woven artifacts found inside are not just objects, but evidence of a sophisticated and forgotten knowledge system, proving that prehistoric humans may have reached levels of technical mastery far beyond what we once believed. And the lingering question remains: how many ancient technologies have been lost simply because they were never carved in stone? If such advanced textile and material technologies existed over 10,000 years ago and then almost completely disappeared, how many other ancient technologies might we have never discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rising from a limestone plateau overlooking the valleys of southwestern Crimea, the ancient cave settlement known as Eski Kerman Cave City appears at first glance like a natural cliff formation. But a closer look reveals something far more extraordinary. Hidden within the rock face are hundreds of precisely carved chambers, corridors, stairways, and sanctuaries. Archaeologists estimate that more than 340 artificial caves were cut directly into the limestone plateau, forming an entire city sculpted from solid rock. The site is believed to have emerged around the 6th century during the frontier expansion of the Byzantine Empire, when fortified settlements were established to defend trade routes and agricultural valleys. Yet even with this historical context, the scale and technical execution of Eski Kerman remain deeply puzzling. Unlike ordinary rock shelters created by erosion, nearly every chamber here bears clear signs of deliberate engineering. Walls appear remarkably flat, ceilings curve smoothly, and corners often meet at angles so consistent that some researchers have compared the interiors to spaces shaped with modern stone-cutting tools. The most striking mystery of Eski Kerman lies in the creation of its immense network of caves. More than 300 rooms are distributed across several levels of the plateau, connected by stairways and narrow passages carved directly into the stone. Some chambers are small, domestic spaces barely large enough for a family, while others are spacious halls used for storage or gatherings. Archaeologists studying the site have identified caves used as homes, wine cellars, granaries, chapels, and defensive galleries. In many cases, the rock floors include carved troughs, shelves, and benches that were formed from the same block of stone as the surrounding walls. This means the builders did not assemble structures piece by piece. They sculpted entire rooms from a single mass of limestone. To carve such spaces would have required enormous labor. Experiments conducted by archaeologists suggest that even with iron chisels, removing a single cubic meter of limestone by hand could take many days of work. Considering that some of the larger caves at Eskikirmen measure several meters in height and depth, the creation of hundreds of such chambers would represent thousands of hours of continuous stone cutting. The scale becomes even more impressive when compared with other cave cities of the region. Sites such as Mangup Kale Cave Fortress or Chufut Kale Cave City also feature rock-cut architecture, yet Eskikirmen stands out for the density and organization of its caves. Many of the chambers are aligned along narrow terraces that follow the contour of the plateau, suggesting a carefully planned urban layout rather than random excavation. In some areas, the caves appear stacked vertically, creating a multi-level structure similar to an apartment complex carved into stone. This raises a key question. How did the builders maintain such consistent geometry without modern measuring instruments? Archaeologists studying tool marks have identified patterns consistent with iron chisels and picks, but the precision of many surfaces suggests that the workers followed strict construction methods, possibly guided by wooden templates or cords used as measuring lines. The mystery deepens when examining the defensive design of the caves. Eskikirmen was not simply a collection of dwellings. It functioned as a fortified settlement controlling the surrounding valleys. The plateau itself rises roughly 300 meters above the surrounding landscape, with steep cliffs forming natural walls on most sides. Only a few narrow paths allow access to the summit. Along these routes, archaeologists have found caves carved specifically for defense, including chambers with narrow openings that resemble arrow slits. From inside these spaces, defenders could observe approaching enemies while remaining protected by thick layers of stone. Some vertical shafts appear to have been used to drop stones or boiling liquids onto attackers attempting to climb the slopes. The integration of architecture and terrain suggests a sophisticated understanding of military strategy, comparable in concept to later medieval fortresses. Archaeological research at Eskikirmen began in earnest during the 19th century, when explorers first documented the caves and mapped the plateau. More systematic excavations were conducted in the 20th century by Soviet archaeologists who uncovered fragments of pottery, metal tools, and religious objects within the chambers. These discoveries confirmed that the caves were inhabited for several centuries, likely from the 6th through the 13th century. The evidence of churches carved into the rock further indicates the presence of a Christian community connected to Byzantine cultural traditions. In one cave chapel, faint traces of frescoes were discovered on the walls, suggesting that the stone interior once served as a decorated place of worship. The presence of such religious spaces reinforces the idea that Eskikirmen was not merely a military outpost, but a fully developed town. Another remarkable aspect of the cave system is the presence of water infrastructure carved directly into the rock. On a plateau where natural springs are scarce, the survival of a permanent settlement would have depended on careful water management. Archaeologists have identified reservoirs and channels designed to collect rainwater and direct it into storage basins. One of the larger cisterns is estimated to have held tens of thousands of liters of water. The floors of these basins were carved with subtle slopes to ensure that water flowed toward collection points rather than stagnating. Such engineering suggests that the builders possessed practical knowledge of hydraulic principles, even if their techniques were developed through experience rather than formal science. Yet despite decades of research, the greatest question remains the same. How was such a vast network of caves created with the technology available at the time? Iron chisels and hammers could certainly cut limestone, but producing hundreds of chambers with relatively smooth walls would have required extraordinary coordination and labour. Some researchers believe that the work may have been carried out gradually over generations, with each new family expanding the caves as the population grew. Others argue that at least part of the complex must have been excavated during a concentrated construction phase directed by a centralized authority. The truth may lie somewhere between these possibilities, but definitive evidence remains elusive. The final mystery surrounding Eskikirmen concerns its sudden decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement was abandoned sometime in the 13th century, possibly during the wave of destruction associated with the Mongol invasions of Europe. However, some artifacts indicate that parts of the city may have been deserted even earlier. The caves that once housed families, stored harvests, and echoed with daily life gradually fell silent, leaving behind an empty labyrinth carved into the cliffs. Today, the plateau stands as a silent monument to a society capable of shaping an entire city from living rock. The hundreds of caves of Eskikirmen remain a powerful reminder that ancient communities often possess technical skills far more advanced than we assume. Even after centuries of study, the question still lingers among archaeologists and historians alike. What methods, organization, and determination allowed the builders of this forgotten city to transform a barren limestone plateau into one of the most remarkable cave settlements ever created? How were ancient builders able to carve more than 300 caves into the rock cliffs of Eskikirmen Cave City with such remarkable precision using only primitive tools? What techniques do you think they used? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Valley Temple of Khafre stands at the edge of the Giza Plateau as one of the most intriguing architectural structures associated with the pyramid complex of the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre, who ruled Egypt around the 26th century BCE. Unlike many other temples of ancient Egypt built primarily from limestone blocks, this structure was constructed using enormous slabs of red granite transported from the quarries of Aswan, located nearly 800 kilometers to the south along the Nile. Archaeological excavations carried out during the 19th and early 20th centuries, most notably those directed by the German Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt, and later studied by numerous architectural historians, revealed that the temple was not only remarkably well preserved, but also built with a level of stone precision that continues to provoke debate among engineers, archaeologists, and historians alike. Inside the temple, massive granite blocks weighing between 40 and 50 tons each form walls that appear almost seamless, their surfaces polished and fitted so tightly that in many places even a thin blade cannot be inserted between them. Granite is one of the hardest stones commonly used in ancient architecture, with a hardness approaching 7 on the Mohs scale, which means shaping it requires tools capable of exerting tremendous force and maintaining consistent precision. According to the traditional archaeological interpretation, Egyptian workers primarily used copper chisels, stone pounding tools made of diorite, and abrasive sand to cut and shape granite. However, when modern engineers attempt to replicate the same degree of flatness and precision using only these tools, the process proves extraordinarily slow and labor-intensive, raising questions about how ancient craftsmen could have produced such vast quantities of perfectly dressed stone within the time frame of a single royal construction project. The interior of the temple further intensifies this mystery. 16 monolithic granite pillars once stood in the central hall, each carved from a single block and polished to an almost mirror-like finish. Their edges are remarkably straight and their angles close to perfect right angles, suggesting careful measurement and advanced planning. Beneath these pillars lies a floor composed of large black basalt slabs, another extremely hard volcanic stone that would have required sophisticated cutting techniques. These basalt slabs are arranged with striking precision, forming a smooth and stable floor surface that has endured for more than 4,000 years. Archaeologists have also discovered that the outer casing of the temple was originally covered with finely polished white limestone from the quarries of Tura, creating a dramatic visual contrast with the dark granite interior. This combination of different stone types, each with very different hardness and structural properties, would have required an advanced understanding of stoneworking and architectural planning. Comparable levels of stone precision are sometimes seen in other ancient monuments, such as the carefully aligned blocks of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the polygonal masonry of Puma Punku, or the enormous megalithic stones of Baalbek Trilithon. Yet the Valley Temple is unique because it combines enormous block size with extremely tight joints and highly polished surfaces within a single structure. Despite decades of research, some of the most fascinating aspects of the temple remain unresolved. The technical mysteries surrounding its construction continue to challenge conventional explanations. One of the most debated questions concerns the cutting and shaping of granite itself. Granite is significantly harder than copper, the primary metal known to have been used in Egyptian tools during the Old Kingdom. Experimental archaeology has shown that granite can indeed be worked using copper tools and abrasive sand, but producing surfaces as flat and smooth as those found in the Valley Temple would require enormous time and careful craftsmanship. Some granite blocks within the temple show surfaces that appear almost machine-like in their regularity, leading a few researchers to suggest that ancient craftsmen may have employed techniques that are not yet fully understood, possibly involving advanced abrasive processes or highly specialized stoneworking methods that have left little archaeological evidence behind. Another unresolved issue involves the precision with which the blocks were fitted together. Many of the joints between stones show no evidence of mortar or binding material. Instead, the stones appear to have been carefully shaped so that their surfaces fit together with near-perfect contact, creating structural stability through sheer weight and friction. Achieving this kind of fit requires extremely careful measurement and alignment. Yet the tools used for such precise measurement during the Old Kingdom are still a matter of debate. Wooden measuring rods, plumb lines, and leveling instruments are known from later Egyptian contexts, but the exact techniques used to ensure perfect alignment of blocks weighing dozens of tons remain uncertain. Transportation also presents a formidable puzzle. The granite blocks used in the temple were quarried in Aswan, where archaeologists have identified ancient quarry marks and partially carved blocks that provide insight into Egyptian stone extraction methods. However, moving blocks weighing 40 tons or more over a distance of hundreds of kilometers would have required a complex logistical operation involving river barges, sledges, and large labor forces. Relief carvings from later periods depict the transportation of large statues on sledges pulled by workers over lubricated ground. But scaling this method up to move dozens of massive granite blocks remains a challenge that modern researchers continue to analyze. Finally, there is the question of polishing. The granite surfaces within the temple are not merely cut, they are also polished to a level that reflects light and gives the stone a refined, almost ceremonial appearance. Modern granite polishing typically involves mechanical grinding with increasingly fine abrasives, yet the exact sequence of tools and abrasives used by ancient Egyptian craftsmen is still debated. Some scholars believe that quartz sand combined with stone polishing tools may have produced the effect, while others argue that achieving such uniform polish across massive surfaces would have required techniques far more sophisticated than currently understood. These unresolved questions are what make the Valley Temple of Khafre so fascinating to archaeologists and historians today. While mainstream Egyptology credits its construction to the organized labor and engineering knowledge of Egypt's Old Kingdom, the remarkable precision of its granite masonry still raises debates about the techniques used. Even after decades of research, the complete explanation of how such massive and precise stone architecture was achieved more than 4,000 years ago remains uncertain, leaving the temple as both a monument to Khafre and a lasting mystery of ancient engineering. How do you think the ancient Egyptians were able to cut, transport, and fit these massive granite blocks with such astonishing precision? Share your thoughts or theories in the comments below. History usually moves forward. It builds, peaks, declines, and disappears, leaving behind a clear direction like a line drawn across time. But there are places where that line does not behave as expected, places where it fractures, bends back on itself and repeats. Dinaghetia is one of those places, not because of a single extraordinary event, but because of something far more unsettling. It was never meant to be a one-time city. It was returned to, again and again, across centuries, by completely different civilizations that should have had no reason to follow the same choice so precisely. On the edge of the Danube, where the river slows and widens before pushing toward the Black Sea, the remains of Dinaghetia sit quietly, almost unremarkable at first glance. Low stone walls, broken foundations, scattered outlines of buildings that no longer exist. Nothing about it suggests inevitability. Nothing about it appears unique enough to explain why it mattered. And yet, this exact point on the map was chosen, abandoned, rediscovered, and rebuilt multiple times, first by local Dacian communities, then by the expanding power of the Roman Empire, and later by Byzantine forces trying to hold together what remained of a fractured frontier. The pattern begins before the Romans ever arrived. Early fortifications appeared here not as a grand city, but as a functional outpost, something placed with intent rather than ambition. Then Rome came, and instead of selecting a new optimized location, they reinforced what was already there. Stone replaced earth, geometry replaced improvisation, but the position itself remained unchanged, as if the decision had already been made long before Roman engineers imposed their order onto it. When the empire weakened and external pressures intensified, Dinaghetia was struck, damaged, partially erased. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end. History tends to abandon what fails, but not here. Instead of fading into obscurity, Dinaghetia reappears. Not immediately, not continuously, but persistently. The Byzantines return to the same ground, not to create something entirely new, but to reconstruct what had already been lost. Walls are repaired, not redesigned. Foundations are reused, not relocated. The city does not evolve in a straight line. It accumulates. Each phase of construction sits on top of the previous one, like layers of memory that were never fully erased. The result is not a single coherent structure, but a stack of intentions separated by time yet bound to the same coordinates. This is where the anomaly begins to take shape, because Dinaghetia is not located at the most defensible position along the Danube. It is not the highest elevation, nor the most inaccessible terrain. It does not dominate the landscape in the way other long-lived fortresses do. In purely strategic terms, it is good but not exceptional. And yet, across centuries of conflict, migration, and technological change, it is consistently selected as if it were indispensable. That consistency becomes harder to explain the more closely it is examined. Civilizations that did not share continuity of governance, culture, or long-term planning all converged on the same decision. They did not inherit a thriving metropolis that forced their hand. More often than not, what they found was ruin, broken walls, collapsed structures, evidence of failure, and still they chose to build again. The architecture itself reflects this unusual relationship with time. There is no clear final version of Dino Gettier, no moment where it reaches a definitive form. Instead, it exists as overlapping fragments. Roman precision embedded within earlier layouts. Byzantine repairs cutting through older geometries. Lines that should align but do not, because they belong to different centuries. It is not a city that was designed once and perfected over time. It is a place that was repeatedly resumed. Even more striking is what does not happen here. For a location occupied across such a long span, there is no dramatic technological leap tied specifically to Dino Gettier. No revolutionary urban planning that spreads outward. No identifiable phase where it transforms into a dominant regional power. It persists without ascending. It survives without redefining itself. In most cases, longevity and innovation are linked places that last tend to evolve. Dino Gettier resists that pattern. It remains functionally similar across its many lives, as if its purpose never required reinvention. That raises a question that cuts deeper than strategy. Because if Dino Gettier was simply useful, it would have been replaced when better options emerged. If it were merely convenient, it would not have been rebuilt after repeated destruction. The cost of reconstruction labor, materials, time suggests that returning here was not the easiest choice. It was the necessary one. There is something else embedded in its geography, something less obvious than elevation or visibility. The Danube at this point is not just a river, it is a corridor, a threshold between regions, a moving boundary that defines access and control. Dino Gettier does not dominate the river. It sits at a point where movement can be observed, influenced, perhaps constrained in subtle ways. Not the strongest position, but a precise one. A place that does not announce its importance but enforces it through consequence. Over time, this creates a kind of gravitational pull in history. Not a physical force, but a strategic inevitability. When power shifts, when borders move, when old systems collapse, decisions are made under pressure. And under that pressure, different civilizations separated by language and centuries arrive at the same conclusion. This point cannot be ignored. What makes Dino Gettier unsettling is not any single mystery, but the repetition itself. One cycle of destruction and rebuilding can be explained. Two might be coincidence. But over centuries, the pattern becomes too consistent to dismiss as chance. It begins to look less like independent decisions and more like convergence, multiple paths leading back to the same fixed point. And yet, the site never fully transforms into something greater than the sum of its parts. It does not become a capital. It does not anchor an empire. It remains, in a sense, incomplete, as if its role was never to dominate, but to endure, to exist at a threshold where presence mattered more than progress. Perhaps that is the key to understanding it. Dino Gettier was not important because it grew into something extraordinary. It was important because it could not be left behind. Every time it was destroyed, the absence it created was felt immediately. A gap in control, a vulnerability in movement, a silence where there should have been structure. And so, it was rebuilt not out of ambition, but out of necessity. History tends to celebrate what advances. The cities that expand, the empires that innovate, the structures that redefine what is possible. But Dino Gettier belongs to a different category. It is a place defined not by what it became, but by how often it returned. A location where time does not move cleanly forward, but circles back again and again, insisting on continuity even in the face of collapse. And that leaves a final question, one that lingers long after the ruins themselves have been understood. If a place continues to be rebuilt for over 1,000 years, across civilizations that had every opportunity to choose differently, is it truly a matter of strategy? Or is it something deeper, something embedded in the landscape itself that we still do not fully understand? Deep within the limestone ridges of the Harz Mountains in Germany lies Einhornhöhle, a cave whose name, Unicorn Cave, originated from medieval misconceptions, yet whose true significance may be far more unsettling than myth. For centuries, scholars and treasure hunters alike were drawn to this site, convinced that the scattered bones found within belonged to legendary creatures. But as systematic excavations began in the 19th century and continued through the 20th and 21st, a far more complex picture emerged. The cave contains the remains of more than 30 species of Ice Age animals, including cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, and mammoths, alongside unmistakable evidence of both Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens activity. Yet what transforms Einhornhöhle from a paleontological archive into a genuine archaeological mystery is not merely the presence of these bones, but the way they have been preserved, arranged, and altered in ways that challenge conventional scientific explanations, particularly when examined through the lens of what can only be described as illogical preservation. Excavations conducted by German research teams in recent decades, including interdisciplinary studies combining archaeology, geochemistry, and taphonomy, have revealed that many of the bones within Einhornhöhle display a level of preservation that appears inconsistent with standard models of decomposition. Under typical cave conditions, even in stable environments, organic material undergoes gradual mineral replacement, fragmentation, and microbial degradation. In comparable European cave systems such as Chauvet Cave in France or Denisova Cave in Siberia, bones dating back tens of thousands of years often show clear signs of weathering, surface erosion, and biochemical alteration. Yet in Einhornhöhle, certain specimens, some dated to over 50,000 years, retain structural integrity and surface detail at levels that appear anomalously high. Microscopic analysis has shown that collagen traces, which typically degrade rapidly over such timescales, are sometimes preserved in measurable quantities, raising questions about the environmental or possibly artificial factors involved. One of the central puzzles lies in the inconsistency of preservation within the same microenvironment. In some chambers of the cave, bones are heavily degraded, fragmented, and chemically altered, consistent with expectations. Yet only meters away, other remains, belonging to the same species and presumed to be of similar age, appear remarkably intact, with minimal signs of microbial activity or mineral intrusion. This uneven preservation defies the assumption that cave microclimates operate uniformly over small spatial scales. Geological surveys of Einhornhöhle have identified variations in humidity, airflow, and mineral composition, particularly in areas rich in calcium carbonate deposits. These factors can indeed slow decomposition, as calcite layers may encase organic material and shield it from bacteria. However, the degree of preservation observed in some cases exceeds what such natural processes alone would predict, especially when compared to controlled experimental models of fossilization. Adding to the mystery are indications that some bones may have undergone forms of surface modification prior to their long-term preservation. Archaeologists have documented cut marks, polishing patterns, and thermal alterations on certain specimens, suggesting that they were handled, processed, or even deliberately treated by human or Neanderthal inhabitants. In one particularly significant discovery reported in 2023, researchers identified a structured arrangement of large animal bones interpreted as a Neanderthal constructed feature dated to approximately 51,000 years ago. While the structure itself points to advanced spatial organization and symbolic behavior, the condition of the bones used in its construction raises further questions. Many of these elements show a resistance to decay that seems disproportionate to their age and exposure history, prompting speculation that they may have been subjected to processes, intentional or incidental, that enhance their durability. Comparative analysis with other Paleolithic sites strengthens the enigma. At Denisova Cave, for instance, despite similarly cold and stable conditions, bone preservation varies but rarely reaches the level of consistency seen in the best preserved samples from Einhornhöhle. Likewise, in Chauvet Cave, while cave art has survived due to stable environmental conditions, associated organic remains do not exhibit the same anomalous resistance to degradation. This suggests that Einhornhöhle may possess a unique combination of environmental variables, or that its ancient inhabitants engaged in behaviors that inadvertently or deliberately influenced preservation outcomes. Some researchers have proposed that the repeated use of fire within specific chambers could have altered the chemical composition of bone surfaces, creating a form of primitive thermal stabilization. Others have pointed to the possibility of mineral-rich water interacting with organic material in ways that accelerated partial fossilization, effectively locking in structural features before decay could proceed. Yet even these hypotheses struggle to fully account for the observed data. If mineral deposition were the primary factor, one would expect a more uniform distribution of preservation across similarly exposed remains. If thermal alteration were responsible, consistent burn patterns or residues would be evident across all well-preserved samples. Instead, what emerges is a pattern that appears selective, almost curated. Certain bones preserved in exceptional condition, others left to decay, without an immediately obvious natural explanation. This has led some archaeologists to cautiously entertain the idea that prehistoric humans or Neanderthals may have engaged in forms of material handling that, while not technology in the modern sense, nonetheless reflect an intuitive understanding of how to manipulate environmental factors to achieve specific outcomes. The broader implications of this are profound. If the inhabitants of Einhornhöhle were capable of influencing the preservation of organic material, whether through placement, exposure to mineral-rich surfaces, or controlled use of fire, then we may be looking at an early form of applied knowledge that borders on proto-technology. Not technology as a set of tools, but as a system of interactions between material, environment, and intention. Such a perspective aligns with emerging views of Neanderthal cognition, which increasingly emphasize their capacity for abstract thought, planning, and symbolic behavior. The cave, in this sense, becomes not just a shelter or a storage site, but a controlled environment, an experimental space where organic matter was processed, arranged, and perhaps even preserved, with a purpose that remains elusive. Despite more than a century of investigation, Einhornhöhle continues to resist definitive interpretation. Each new excavation, each layer of sediment carefully removed, reveals new data points, but also deepens the central mystery. Radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, and advanced imaging techniques have refined our understanding of chronology and composition. Yet they have not resolved the question of why certain bones have endured in such extraordinary condition, while others have not. The cave stands as a reminder that preservation itself can be as enigmatic as destruction, that what survives the passage of tens of thousands of years may do so not only because of where it lies, but because of how it was treated long before it became a fossil. In the end, Einhornhöhle challenges one of archaeology's most fundamental assumptions, that the past is passively recorded in the material remains we uncover. Here, the evidence suggests something more active, more intentional. Whether the result of unique geological conditions or a forgotten form of human interaction with the environment, the illogical preservation of bones within this cave forces us to reconsider the boundaries between natural process and ancient ingenuity. And in doing so, it leaves us with a question that lingers long after the data has been analysed. Were these bones simply preserved? Or were they, in some way we have yet to understand, made to endure? Civilizations collapse in patterns. Systems fail, trade disappears, knowledge fragments. Yet in the aftermath of the Late Bronze Age collapse, when the Mycenaean world disintegrated around 1200 BCE, one small settlement on the island of Euboea did not follow the script. Lefkandi did not simply survive. It operated with a level of structural planning, material understanding, and long-distance connectivity that should not have been possible in a so-called Dark Age. Systematic excavations at Lefkandi began in the 1960s, led by archaeologists including Mervyn Popham and Nicholas Coldstream. What initially appeared to be a modest settlement quickly revealed stratified occupation layers, spanning the transition from the Late Bronze Age into the Early Iron Age. The defining moment came with the excavation of the Toumba Cemetery, where an unusually large structure later termed the Haroun was uncovered. Its scale, burial contents, and construction method immediately contradicting the prevailing model of cultural decline in post-Mycenaean Greece. The Toumba building measures approximately 50 meters in length and 10 meters in width, a scale that far exceeds most domestic structures in early Iron Age Greece, which rarely surpass 10 to 15 meters. Even Mycenaean megarons, such as those at Mycenae, while monumental, were constructed in stone and tied to centralized palace economies. At Lefkandi, however, the structure was built primarily from perishable materials, timber posts, mud brick walls, and a thatched roof. Yet its layout reveals a level of architectural planning defined by evenly spaced load-bearing columns, symmetrical organization along an elongated axis, and curved apsidal ends that require controlled geometric execution. From an engineering perspective, maintaining structural stability over a 50-meter span using timber and mud brick demands an understanding of weight distribution and lateral forces, and modern reconstructions suggest that post-placement would need to remain within tolerances of only a few centimeters to prevent progressive failure. The paradox is immediate. During the Greek Dark Age, literacy disappears, monumental stone construction declines, and regional connectivity fragments. Yet, no evidence exists of iterative architectural development leading to this structure. No prototypes, no transitional forms, only a design that appears fully realized. Euboea presents a coastal Mediterranean environment marked by seasonal humidity, salt exposure, and localized soil instability, conditions under which mud brick structures typically degrade within decades without continuous maintenance, while untreated timber is highly susceptible to rot and biological damage. Yet the archaeological footprint of the Toumba structure remains sufficiently intact to allow full reconstruction of its ground plan, with evenly spaced post holes, coherent wall lines, and subsidence patterns that indicate controlled structural decay rather than chaotic collapse. This suggests that the builders possessed a working understanding of soil compaction for stable foundations, selective use of timber species with higher resistance to decay, and drainage strategies that prevented water accumulation at structural bases. Comparable mud brick settlements in the Near East, such as Çatalhöyük, required constant rebuilding cycles to maintain structural integrity, whereas at Lefkandi, the building appears to have remained functional long enough to serve a ceremonial role before its intentional burial, raising a deeper question. Not whether such technical knowledge existed, but why it appears here without any visible transmission pathway or developmental lineage. Inside the tomba structure, archaeologists uncovered a burial assemblage that merges multiple ritual traditions into a single, highly coordinated event. A male individual cremated and placed within a bronze amphora imported from Cyprus. A female individual buried intact and adorned with intricate gold jewelry, and the remains of 4 horses carefully arranged and sacrificed nearby. Each element carries distinct cultural implications, cremation becoming dominant in later Greek practice, but remaining rare in earlier Mycenaean elite contexts, inhumation reflecting older traditions, and horse sacrifice representing elite status yet requiring substantial economic resources. Maintaining and sacrificing horses in the early Iron Age implies access to grazing systems, breeding knowledge, and organized labor, while the presence of a Cypriot bronze vessel demonstrates ongoing trade connections across the eastern Mediterranean, spanning distances of several hundred kilometers. In contrast, most contemporaneous sites across mainland Greece show reduced material complexity, limited imports, and simplified burial customs. Lefkandi does not conform to this pattern. Instead, it integrates multiple cultural systems into a unified ritual framework, suggesting deliberate synthesis rather than cultural fragmentation. The late Bronze Age collapse disrupted major trade systems linking the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant, with archaeological evidence from sites such as Ugarit indicating sudden destruction around 1200 BCE and the disappearance of administrative systems like Linear B writing. Yet Lefkandi yields imported goods from Cyprus, the Near East, and possibly Egypt, pointing to the survival of maritime exchange networks in some form. Even a minimal network would require navigational capabilities across open sea distances exceeding 100 kilometers, shipbuilding techniques capable of repeated voyages, and social coordination mechanisms to sustain exchange. Rather than complete collapse, the evidence suggests fragmentation into smaller decentralized systems, with Lefkandi functioning as a node within this reduced but persistent network. If such connectivity continued beyond the visible collapse of major civilizations, then the traditional concept of a total economic breakdown during the Greek Dark Age becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The concentration of gold ornaments, imported ceramics, and high-value materials at Lefkandi indicates the presence of an elite class capable of controlling resources and organizing labor at a level inconsistent with models of societal regression. While post-collapse societies are generally expected to exhibit reduced hierarchy and dispersed wealth, Lefkandi demonstrates centralized authority, access to surplus beyond subsistence needs, and continuity in symbolic and ritual expression. Compared to other settlements across mainland Greece during the same period, many of which show smaller population sizes, limited artifact diversity, and simplified construction, Lefkandi emerges not merely as an anomaly, but as a direct contradiction of the expected trajectory of decline. By the 9th century BCE, Lefkandi enters a phase of decline and is eventually abandoned without clear evidence of violent destruction, large-scale fire, or catastrophic environmental change. There is no direct continuation into a larger urban center, and perhaps more significantly, no architectural lineage linking the tomba structure to later Greek temple forms, which adopt entirely different proportions and construction systems. The knowledge embedded in the design of the Haroun does not visibly transfer into subsequent architectural traditions. It appears within the archaeological record, persists for a limited period, and then vanishes without continuity. What do you think Lefkandi really represents? A rare anomaly in a broken world, or a surviving fragment of a hidden network we have yet to fully understand? Built on a barren limestone ridge above what was once open sea, Enisala Fortress should not exist the way it does. Its walls look crude, its location impractical, and its resources insufficient. Yet it stood for centuries stable, functional, and strategically dominant without leaving behind a clear explanation of how it was engineered to work. Unlike monumental ancient sites rediscovered through dramatic excavations, Enisala was never truly lost. Local populations in the region of northern Dobruja had always known of its presence. However, systematic archaeological attention only began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when researchers started mapping the ruins and attempting to reconstruct its purpose. Initial surveys revealed a fortress dating roughly to the 13th–14th centuries, possibly linked to the maritime trade networks of Genoa. But even from the earliest measurements, inconsistencies emerged. The structure did not align cleanly with known Genoese construction patterns, nor did it follow standard Byzantine defensive layouts. Instead, it appeared adapted, or perhaps improvised yet paradoxically precise. At first glance, the placement of Enisala seems logical. Elevation provides visibility, and visibility ensures control. From its peak, the fortress commands a sweeping view over the Razm-Sino lagoon system, a body of water that, during the medieval period, connected more directly to the Black Sea. But this apparent advantage hides a deeper contradiction. The hill is geologically composed of compact limestone, offering structural stability but little else. There are no natural freshwater springs on the summit. Soil is thin, unsuitable for agriculture. Wind exposure is high, increasing erosion and reducing long-term habitability. From a logistical standpoint, the site is hostile. Transporting construction material alone would have required immense effort. A single limestone block weighing between 200 and 500 kilograms, multiplied across hundreds, possibly thousands of units, implies a coordinated labor force and sustained supply chain. Yet no clear remnants of access roads, ramps, or staging infrastructure have been identified at a scale matching such an operation. Compared to other medieval fortresses such as those built in the Carpathian regions, where forests, water, and transport routes were accessible, Enisala stands out as an anomaly. It is a fortress built where building a fortress makes the least practical sense. At a distance, the walls of Enisala appear unrefined. Stones are irregular in shape, lacking the polished geometry seen in classical Roman or Hellenistic construction. There is no evidence of advanced cutting techniques producing perfectly squared blocks, and mortar, where present, is minimal and inconsistent. Yet structural analysis tells a different story. Despite their irregularity, the stones are fitted with a level of contact precision that minimizes voids, while load distribution appears carefully managed, with larger stones positioned at stress-bearing points and smaller fragments used as stabilizing fillers. This technique, often described as adaptive interlocking, allows irregular materials to achieve surprising mechanical stability. Modern engineering comparisons reveal something striking. In experimental reconstructions of dry stone systems, structural stability increases significantly when contact surfaces exceed approximately 70% coverage between adjacent stones, and visual surveys of Enisala's walls suggest comparable or even higher contact ratios in certain segments. The walls have endured for more than 6 centuries, surviving seismic activity, long-term weathering, and human neglect without catastrophic collapse. This creates a paradox. The builders lacked precision tools capable of machining stone to exact dimensions, yet they achieved a system where imprecision was compensated through placement intelligence. In contrast, Roman fortifications relied heavily on standardized blocks and mortar bonding, reducing the need for micro-adjustments. While Enisala appears to operate on the opposite principal variability, controlled through human calibration rather than mechanical uniformity. How this consistency was achieved remains unclear. Without laser leveling, without standardized measurement systems, and without written engineering manuals describing the process, the builders maintained alignment, verticality, and load balance across extended wall sections. One possibility is iterative fitting placing, adjusting, removing, and refitting stones until optimal contact was achieved. But this would dramatically increase construction time and labor cost. Another hypothesis suggests the use of simple but effective tools such as plumb lines, tensioned cords, and reference frames, combined with highly trained labor capable of interpreting structural feedback in real time. Still, this does not fully explain the uniformity observed across different sections of the fortress. The deeper question remains: was this a standardized construction method shared across regions, or the result of localized expertise that has since been lost? Enisala's layout indicates more than basic fortification. The positioning of towers and walls creates overlapping fields of vision, allowing surveillance across a wide radius of the surrounding lagoon system. Measured sightlines extend far beyond immediate defensive needs. In clear atmospheric conditions, visibility can reach distances exceeding 20 kilometers, effectively transforming the fortress into a monitoring station rather than a purely defensive structure. This aligns partially with known Genoese practices, where coastal fortifications doubled as trade control points. Yet most Genoese outposts were located directly on navigable coastlines, not inland on elevated ridges separated from immediate maritime access. The implication is unusual. Enisala may have been designed not only to defend territory, but to observe and regulate movement across a dynamic and shifting landscape, where coastlines, waterways, and economic routes were constantly evolving. No fortress can function without water. The minimum daily requirement for a garrison accounting for drinking, cooking, and sanitation would likely exceed several liters per person, meaning that even a modest group of 50 to 100 individuals would require hundreds of liters per day. Yet at Enisala, no confirmed deep wells have been identified within the core structure. No large-scale cistern systems have been definitively documented, and no clear aqueduct or channeling infrastructure connects the fortress to external water sources. This absence is critical. Rainwater collection is a theoretical solution, but it demands storage capacity and seasonal consistency, and without substantial reservoirs, such a system would remain highly vulnerable to drought conditions. This raises a fundamental possibility. Enisala was not designed for permanent occupation. Instead, it may have functioned as a temporary control point, activated during specific periods such as trade seasons, military operations, or surveillance cycles, rather than maintained continuously. Yet this introduces another contradiction. If the structure was only intermittently used, why invest in such durable and labor-intensive construction? Geological and sedimentary studies indicate that the region surrounding Enisala underwent significant transformation over the past several centuries. What was once open marine access gradually became a system of enclosed lagoons due to sediment accumulation carried by the Danube River. This process altered trade routes, reduced navigability, and effectively isolated the fortress from the very network it may have been built to monitor. Yet there is little evidence of architectural adaptation. No expansions, no redesigns, no attempts to reorient the fortress toward emerging routes. It remained fixed, both functionally and structurally, while its environment evolved around it. In your opinion, is Enisala just an ordinary medieval fortress, or a technical system we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. coastal city slowly lost the sea, yet refused to collapse. Settlement built on unstable ground still stood for over a millennium, and beneath it all, a water system that should not have worked, yet did. Histria is not just an ancient ruin. It is a contradiction preserved in stone. Founded in the 7th century BCE by settlers from Miletus, Histria became the earliest Greek colony on the western coast of the Black Sea, and when systematic archaeological excavations began in the early 20th century, they revealed a continuous sequence of occupation lasting over 1,000 years, with each layer uncovering fortifications, temples, and hydraulic systems, while at the same time intensifying a central mystery: how a city could survive in environmental conditions that should have made long-term habitation unsustainable. Histria was originally established directly along the Black Sea coastline, but geological evidence shows that sediment carried by the Danube River gradually pushed the shoreline outward over centuries, transforming the coastal landscape so dramatically that today the ruins lie several kilometers inland, separated from open water by lagoon systems. This was not a minor shift, as studies estimate a displacement of approximately 5 to 7 kilometers over 2,000 years, a change that should have effectively destroyed any port-dependent economy. Yet, archaeological findings reveal continued occupation and economic activity long after this transformation, with imported amphorae, coinage, and ceramics still appearing in later layers, suggesting that trade networks remained functional despite the loss of direct maritime access, raising a critical, unresolved question: how did Histria sustain its role in regional exchange without a port? Some theories propose the existence of artificial canals or seasonal navigation routes through the lagoons, but unlike well-documented harbour systems such as those of Alexandria, no large-scale infrastructure has been definitively identified, leaving the mechanism of adaptation largely invisible. The city was constructed on soft, alluvial soil, a substrate highly prone to subsidence and instability, which modern engineering would classify as unsuitable for long-term structural development. Yet despite this, Histria's defensive walls, public buildings, and sacred structures endured for centuries, with excavations revealing layered foundations composed of alternating materials that appear to distribute load and reduce localized stress, a technique that closely resembles modern principles of load dispersion and ground stabilization, even though there is no textual evidence that ancient builders possessed formalized knowledge of such geotechnical methods. In contrast, cities like Pompeii were built on relatively stable volcanic terrain, minimizing the need for complex foundational adaptations, which makes Histria's persistence even more striking, leading to a fundamental question: was this engineering knowledge developed purely through empirical trial and error, or does it reflect a broader, systematized understanding that has not survived in written form? The most perplexing aspect of Histria lies beneath its surface in its water systems, as the city occupied a transitional zone where freshwater inflow from inland sources met marine intrusion from the Black Sea, creating fluctuating salinity conditions that would typically contaminate groundwater and render stable freshwater access extremely difficult. In modern hydrogeology, maintaining potable water in such an environment requires detailed knowledge of aquifer dynamics, pressure gradients, and permeability. Yet archaeological evidence shows that Histria achieved precisely this, with excavations uncovering deep wells that consistently yielded fresh water, even in close proximity to saline lagoon systems, some extending several meters below the surface, indicating deliberate targeting of confined aquifers trapped beneath impermeable sediment layers, while additional findings suggest the presence of organized water channels and storage structures, pointing toward planned water management rather than opportunistic use. The contradiction becomes more pronounced when considering that in coastal environments, Freshwater typically forms a thin lens floating above denser saltwater, a fragile system easily disrupted by over-extraction or environmental change, and according to modern models, sustaining such a lens over long periods requires careful control and understanding of recharge rates. Yet Hystria's system appears to have functioned for centuries without clear evidence of advanced filtration or monitoring infrastructure. Comparisons can be made to the Qanat systems of ancient Persia, which demonstrate sophisticated underground water extraction, but those systems operated in more stable geological conditions and are well documented, whereas Hystria's environment was far more unpredictable and its methods remain undocumented. The absence of clear filtration systems further deepens the mystery, as there is no definitive evidence of advanced purification technology, raising the question of how salinization was avoided, with possible explanations including precise placement of wells in zones where freshwater pressure exceeded saline intrusion, seasonal regulation of water extraction, or the use of natural geological barriers that were understood intuitively but never formally recorded. Yet all of these remain speculative, because the central paradox persists. The system worked, but the mechanism behind its long-term reliability is still not fully understood. Urban development typically follows a recognizable pattern of gradual evolution, with cities expanding incrementally, adapting infrastructure over time, and refining layouts through successive phases. But at Hystria, certain sectors appear to have been constructed with a level of organization that suggests prior planning rather than organic growth, as street grids, drainage systems, and building alignments display coherence and intentionality from relatively early stages, a pattern that contrasts with cities like Miletus, where urban planning became more structured only after extended development, creating an anomaly in which Hystria seems to behave as though it was designed with a degree of foresight that would normally require generations of accumulated knowledge, raising the question of whether this reflects an accelerated learning process or the application of pre-existing planning principles that have not been preserved in historical records. Unlike cities that ended abruptly due to catastrophic events such as volcanic eruptions, invasions, or earthquakes, Hystria's decline appears to have been gradual, with no definitive destruction layer, no widespread evidence of burning, and no clear signs of violent abandonment, instead showing a slow loss of function over time, likely influenced by environmental changes such as the expansion of lagoon systems and the shifting of trade routes, which reduced the city's strategic importance. However, this leads to a deeper paradox. As a settlement that demonstrated the ability to adapt to unstable ground, shifting coastlines, and complex hydrological conditions, ultimately failed to adjust to long-term environmental transformation, raising the unresolved question: why did a system capable of solving immediate and highly complex challenges prove incapable of sustaining itself against gradual, predictable change? Do you think these systems were the result of accumulated experience or traces of a lost knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. High above the dense forests of western India, rising nearly 700 meters into the sky, the staircase of Kalavantin Durg cuts into a near-vertical wall of basalt, and at first glance, it looks like a path dangerous, narrow, intimidating, but the longer you study it, the more it begins to resemble something else entirely, a technical paradox carved into stone, because this is not simply a staircase, it is a construction problem that modern engineering can explain only in fragments, a structure that exists physically, yet resists complete reconstruction in theory, as if the process that created it has been erased, while the result remains suspended in time. The first documented surveys of Kalavantin Durg by British colonial officers in the 19th century treated the structure as a defensive hill fort, likely associated with regional powers such as the Marathas, and early descriptions focused on its strategic value, its commanding view over ancient trade routes, and its natural isolation. Yet even in those early reports, one detail stood out with unusual intensity. The steps, carved directly into the rock face, ascending at angles approaching 70 to 80 degrees, in several sections narrowing to less than half a meter in width, with no railings, no anchors, no visible sockets for scaffolding, only a sequence of carefully cut footholds rising into open air, defying not only comfort but expectation, because even today, standing at the base and looking up, it is difficult to imagine not just climbing them but creating them. Subsequent archaeological attention, particularly throughout the 20th century, shifted toward material analysis and comparative study, revealing that the rock itself belongs to the Deccan Traps, a massive volcanic formation composed primarily of dense basalt, known for its strength and resistance to erosion. And through field testing alongside comparisons with nearby monumental sites such as Ellora Caves, researchers confirmed that ancient Indian craftsmen possessed the necessary tools, iron chisels, hammerstones, and controlled percussion techniques to cut and shape this material with remarkable precision, as demonstrated by Ellora, where entire multi-story temple complexes were carved downward from solid rock with alignment accuracy measured in centimeters. Yet Calavant in Durg introduces a critical variable absent from those sites, because while Ellora was carved from stable horizontal working surfaces with predictable access, here the work surface is a near vertical cliff, a plane where balance, positioning, and even survival become uncertain variables, and that single difference transforms a known capability into an unresolved mystery. Later field measurements conducted by trekking groups and independent surveyors documented the geometry of the staircase in greater detail, showing that while the steps are not perfectly uniform, they follow a consistent functional pattern, with tread depths averaging between 15 and 20 centimeters, just sufficient for a human foothold and riser heights, adapting dynamically to the natural contours of the rock while still maintaining a climbable rhythm, suggesting that the builders were not carving randomly but were instead following an intentional system, a logic embedded into each cut. And this level of consistency implies coordination among multiple workers, shared understanding of spacing, and possibly even a conceptual design before execution. Yet despite this apparent organization, no inscriptions, no quarry marks, no tool signatures, and no construction diagrams have ever been discovered, leaving behind only the completed form without any surviving evidence of the method that produced it. And it is here, at the level of method, that the mystery becomes most resistant to explanation, because while the material can be identified and the geometry can be measured, the process itself remains hidden. And one widely discussed hypothesis suggests that the staircase was carved from the top downward, meaning that workers first reached the summit by an alternative route, perhaps a natural ridge or slope that has since eroded away, and then progressively cut the steps as they descended, a technique that aligns with known practices at other rock-cut sites across India. Yet this hypothesis immediately encounters a critical contradiction, because extensive surveys of the surrounding terrain have failed to identify any viable ancient access path capable of supporting the movement of tools, labor, and materials to the summit, with the slopes around Calavantin remaining steep, unstable, and in many areas effectively inaccessible even to modern climbers without specialized equipment, raising the possibility that the original access route, if it existed at all, has been completely lost to geological time. A second hypothesis proposes the construction of wooden scaffolding rising from the base of the cliff, suggesting that temporary frameworks made from timber, could have provided platforms for workers to stand on while carving each step upward in sequence. Yet this theory too faces significant challenges, as no archaeological evidence of such scaffolding has been found, no post holes drilled into the rock, no anchor points, no remnants of organic material preserved in crevices, and beyond the absence of evidence lies a deeper structural question. Because the cliff face is exposed to strong seasonal monsoon winds and intense rainfall, conditions that would place enormous stress on any wooden structure attempting to cling to such a vertical surface, making the long-term stability of such scaffolding highly questionable. A third line of speculation explores the possibility of rope-based construction techniques, where workers may have used fiber ropes, primitive harness systems, or bodyweight anchoring methods to suspend themselves against the rock while carving, drawing loose parallels with certain traditional climbing practices observed in isolated cultures. Yet this hypothesis remains speculative at best, as no tools, no visual depictions, and no surviving artifacts directly connect such methods to the builders of Kalavantinderg. And even if such techniques were employed, they do not fully resolve the core problem, because while it is possible to climb a vertical surface using ropes, the act of carving consistent, load-bearing steps into hard basalt while suspended in mid-air introduces a level of complexity that even modern climbers with advanced gear and safety systems rarely attempt, and certainly do not perform with the precision observed here. When placed alongside other ancient rock-cut achievements, the uniqueness of Kalavantin becomes even more pronounced, because at Petra, monumental structures were carved into sandstone cliffs but relied on ledges and constructed platforms that provided stable working conditions. And at Machu Picchu, steep stairways were integrated into mountainous terrain, yet supported by terraces and retaining walls that distributed weight and provided access. Whereas Kalavantinderg eliminates these supporting systems entirely, isolating the act of carving from any stable base, reducing the process to a direct interaction between human and vertical stone. And it is precisely this isolation that makes the site so difficult to reconcile with known construction methodologies. Time itself adds another layer to the puzzle, as erosion patterns indicate that the steps have endured for several centuries, possibly dating back to medieval periods or earlier, with edges worn yet still structurally intact. And despite continuous exposure to heavy rainfall, temperature variation, and natural weathering, the staircase remains usable, suggesting that the builders not only understood how to cut basalt, but also how to select sections of rock less prone to fracturing, working with the natural grain and internal structure of the material to maximize durability, an insight that implies accumulated knowledge rather than isolated experimentation. Yet no intermediate stages of development have been identified, no abandoned staircases, no incomplete sections, no gradual evolution of technique, leaving Kalavantin to appear in the historical record as a fully realized concept without visible precursors. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire structure lies not in what has been discovered, but in what remains absent, because archaeology depends as much on process as it does on outcome. And here, the process is missing, leaving only a finished artifact that suggests a sequence of actions we cannot fully reconstruct. With each proposed explanation containing gaps, each theory relying on assumptions that cannot be verified, and in that absence, the staircase becomes more than a physical object. It becomes a boundary marker, defining the limits of current understanding. Kalavantinderg forces that boundary into focus, suggesting that ancient builders may have possessed not only the physical capability to shape hard volcanic stone, but also the spatial awareness, coordination, and adaptive strategies required to operate in environments that remain challenging even today, challenging the modern assumption that complex construction is inseparable from advanced technology, and raising a possibility that is difficult to dismiss, that the limitations we attribute to ancient engineering may reflect gaps in our interpretation rather than gaps in their ability. In your opinion, how was the Kalavantin-Durg staircase built under such seemingly impossible conditions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A. Towering walls are absent, monumental gates never existed, and obvious signs of engineering mastery seem nowhere to be found. Only a low mound of fractured sandstone rising quietly from the Ukrainian steppe. Yet hidden within this unassuming formation lies one of the most persistent contradictions in archaeology. Thousands of carvings, some dating back over 10,000 years, are preserved inside a structure that should not protect them, arranged in a system that should not exist, and maintained across time by cultures that never left behind a written explanation. Humanity has built pyramids, temples, and cities whose scale alone demands attention. But Kamiana Mohyla operates differently. It does not overwhelm, it confuses, because everything about it appears simple until you look closer. Unlike sites such as Göbekli Tepe, which shocked archaeologists with its sudden emergence in the 1990s, Kamiana Mohyla was never truly discovered in a single moment. It had always been there, visible as a low stone hill rising no more than 15 meters above the surrounding plain, yet its significance remained hidden. Systematic study began in the 19th century, when early explorers noticed unusual carvings inside narrow cavities formed by stacked sandstone slabs. Later excavations throughout the 20th century revealed over 3,000 petroglyphs distributed across dozens of chambers, while radiocarbon dating of associated organic material suggests usage spanning from the late Paleolithic over 12,000 years ago through the Bronze Age and into historical periods. This is where the anomaly begins. Unlike Lascaux Cave, where art is confined to a specific cultural horizon around 17,000 years ago, Kamiana Mohyla shows evidence of continuous reuse. As different cultures separated by millennia return to the same confined stone spaces and added to the same visual system without erasing it. Geologically, Kamiana Mohyla is classified as a natural sandstone outcrop formed by sedimentary deposition and erosion, where wind and water fractured the rock into large slabs that gradually collapsed into a mound. But inside this natural formation, chambers appear with consistent spatial proportions, often just large enough for human occupancy, while passageways connect spaces in ways that resemble intentional circulation paths, and some ceilings and walls align in planes that seem structurally stabilized beyond what loose sandstone stacking should allow. In comparison, natural cave systems such as Carlsbad caverns form through dissolution processes, producing smooth, continuous voids rather than stacked, layered chambers with discrete entry points. Here the geometry is different, raising a critical question. Was Kamiana Mohyla merely modified, or subtly engineered using the natural structure as a foundation? Across more than 3,000 recorded carvings, patterns begin to appear, including repeated motifs of animals such as bulls, horses, and deer, abstract symbols arranged in sequences rather than isolation, and overlapping layers that preserve earlier carvings while integrating new ones. In sites like Lascaux Cave, artistic layering often results in visual chaos over time. Yet at Kamiana Mohyla, the layering is selective, with later carvings frequently avoiding damage to earlier ones, suggesting a form of cultural memory or rule-based continuation. Some researchers have proposed that these carvings functioned not merely as art, but as a proto-symbolic communication system, a precursor to structured language or ritual encoding. Yet no decipherable grammar has been confirmed, raising a paradox. A system complex enough to persist, but too ambiguous to decode. Radiocarbon evidence and stylistic analysis indicate that the site was used across at least 6,000 to 8,000 years. For comparison, the entire span of recorded written history from early Sumerian cuneiform around 5,000 years ago to today is shorter than the active usage period of Kamiana Mohyla. And yet, unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, there is no surviving written language, no monumental architecture nearby, and no centralized civilization clearly tied to the site. Despite this, the internal logic of the carvings persists. How does a symbolic system remain stable over millennia without formal documentation? This is not just a cultural question, it is a systems problem. Sandstone is not a durable medium. On the Mohs hardness scale, it typically ranks between 6 and 7, yet its real weakness lies in its porosity, as water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycles, and wind erosion gradually degrade its surface. In exposed environments, detailed carvings in sandstone can lose definition within a few thousand years or even less under harsh conditions. The Ukrainian steppe presents exactly such conditions, with temperature fluctuations ranging from below -20 degrees Celsius in winter to above 30 degrees in summer, strong seasonal winds capable of transporting abrasive particles, and repeated moisture cycles that promote microfracturing. And yet, inside Kamiana Mohyla, fine lines and shallow engravings remain visible after more than 10 millennia. Interior surfaces show significantly reduced weathering compared to exterior rock faces, and certain chambers maintain stable microenvironments with lower humidity variation. In contrast, petroglyphs at exposed sites like Twyfelfontein, some only a few thousand years old, have experienced notable degradation despite being in arid climates. So why does Kamiana Mohyla preserve detail so effectively? One explanation is microclimate shielding, where stacked sandstone slabs create enclosed spaces that limit airflow, reduce ultraviolet exposure, and buffer temperature fluctuations. Yet this explanation is incomplete. Not all chambers preserve carvings equally. Some show clear degradation while others remain remarkably intact. And the difference often correlates with precise positioning within the structure, including angles of entry, depth from the surface, and orientation relative to prevailing winds. This suggests selective usage. Ancient users may have recognized which chambers offered optimal preservation conditions, effectively choosing locations based on environmental performance. If true, this implies empirical knowledge of material behavior, long-term observation across generations, and intentional placement of information in low-entropy zones. In modern terms, this resembles passive environmental engineering designing systems that stabilize themselves without active intervention. Yet here lies the deeper anomaly. There is no evidence of trial and error progression, as the system appears to function correctly from the earliest known phases. Some chambers exhibit orientations that loosely correspond to solar movement, particularly sunrise and sunset positions during seasonal transitions. While not as precise as megalithic sites like Stonehenge, the alignments are consistent enough to suggest non-random placement, raising the possibility that Kamiana Mohyla served dual purposes as both a repository of symbolic or ritual information and a spatially calibrated environment tied to cyclical time. If so, the carvings may not be static records but part of a dynamic interaction between space, light, and observation. So what do you think, was Kamiana Mahaila a natural formation that humans adapted, or something more deliberate? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The old town of Gadames did not emerge from a single excavation, nor was it revealed by a dramatic archaeological breakthrough. Instead, it was slowly understood, pieced together through fragmented accounts left by European explorers of the 18th and 19th centuries, who described it as an impossible oasis city. Only in the 20th century did systematic architectural surveys and early thermal studies begin to document what was actually happening inside its walls, revealing a pattern that could be measured rather than merely observed. Field measurements showed temperature differences of up to 10 to 15 degrees Celsius between shaded interiors and the surrounding desert, where surface temperatures could exceed 45 degrees Celsius, a gap too large to be explained by shade alone. What initially appeared to be a conventional Saharan settlement gradually revealed itself as a controlled environmental system, one that seemed disproportionately advanced compared to the simplicity of its materials. From above, Gadames appears chaotic, a dense cluster of irregular forms without symmetry, alignment, or visible planning logic. Yet when mapped in detail, the layout reveals an extreme density combined with intentional enclosure that defies expectations of organic growth. Streets are not open corridors but covered, compressed, and interconnected pathways that form a continuous, three-dimensional labyrinth, eliminating direct exposure to sunlight across large portions of the city. Unlike Roman urban models such as Timgad, where rigid orthogonal grids prioritize clarity and expansion, or even medieval Islamic Medinas that evolve organically but retain partial openness, Gadames pushes enclosure to an extreme limit, suggesting that exposure itself was treated as a problem to be solved. This creates a contradiction within conventional urban theory, which assumes irregular layouts are the result of unplanned growth and therefore produce inefficiencies such as dead ends, poor ventilation, and uneven sunlight distribution. Yet in Gadames, the irregularity appears to enhance environmental performance rather than degrade it. Studies of airflow in dense built environments demonstrate that narrow, enclosed passages reduce wind speed while increasing pressure differentials, allowing controlled air movement instead of turbulent flow. And in Gadames, this principle is scaled across the entire Al-Madinat, where covered streets filter and slow hot desert winds, stabilizing temperature and preventing sudden heat spikes while maintaining continuous circulation, behavior that aligns more closely with engineered systems than with accidental urban evolution. The most intensively studied component of Gadames is its network of covered streets, which extend far beyond isolated shaded alleys and instead form a continuous environmental envelope punctuated by carefully positioned openings that regulate both light and airflow. Thermal measurements consistently show that these corridors maintain temperatures significantly lower than exposed desert streets, often by 10 degrees Celsius or more, a difference that cannot be attributed solely to reduced solar radiation, but instead points toward a combined system of shading, ventilation, and material response. In modern engineering, replicating such passive cooling requires detailed simulations involving solar angles, thermal conductivity, and airflow modeling, often using computational fluid dynamics to predict how air will behave in confined geometries. Yet Gadames achieves comparable results through spatial configuration alone. The placement of openings is particularly revealing, as they are neither decorative nor random but appear at calculated intervals that allow hot air to escape upward while limiting direct solar penetration, generating a slow vertical movement of air that resembles what modern engineers define as the stack effect. Comparable techniques can be observed in Persian windcatcher systems, such as those found in Yazd, where towers capture and redirect airflow into interior spaces. But the crucial difference lies in scale and integration, because while windcatchers operate at the level of individual buildings, Gadames distributes the same principle across an entire urban fabric, effectively turning the city itself into a single passive cooling device, a level of systemic integration that remains difficult to explain through incremental trial and error alone. The materials used in Gadames appear deceptively simple, consisting primarily of mud brick, lime plaster, gypsum, and organic fibers, all of which are widely available and commonly used across North Africa and the Middle East. Yet their combined behavior within this Medina suggests a level of control that exceeds ordinary vernacular construction. Walls are often built to substantial thickness, sometimes exceeding 0.5 meter, creating a high thermal mass that absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it gradually at night, producing a delayed heat transfer effect that stabilizes indoor temperatures despite extreme external fluctuations. While the principle of thermal mass is well understood today and widely applied in energy-efficient architecture, experimental data from Adobe structures indicate that achieving optimal thermal lag requires precise calibration of wall thickness, density, and surface treatment, because insufficient thickness allows rapid heat penetration, while excessive thickness leads to heat retention that raises nighttime temperatures. In Gadames, however, this balance appears consistently maintained across different structures, suggesting that builders were not merely applying known materials but were operating within an optimal range that maximizes performance. Comparisons with other Adobe-based settlements, including those found in Morocco, show effective insulation but rarely the same level of systemic consistency, reinforcing the idea that in Gadames walls, streets, and roofs do not function independently but interact as components of a unified thermal network, a level of integration that resembles engineered systems more than isolated architectural decisions. Gadames is not only organized horizontally but vertically, forming a layered structure in which different levels perform distinct environmental and social functions, with enclosed lower streets providing shaded circulation, middle levels serving as thermally stable living spaces, and upper rooftops offering exposure to light and air. This vertical zoning creates a natural convection system in which hot air rises from the lower levels and escapes through rooftop openings while cooler air remains trapped below, establishing a passive circulation loop that regulates temperature without mechanical assistance. In modern sustainable architecture, similar effects are achieved through atriums, ventilation shafts, and solar chimneys that require precise calculations of pressure gradients and temperature differences, yet in Gadames, no such calculations are recorded, even though the system operates with remarkable efficiency. Adding to this complexity is the integration of social structure within the same spatial framework, as historical accounts indicate that rooftops formed a separate circulation network, primarily used by women, effectively creating a dual-layer city where movement patterns align with thermal behavior, suggesting that environmental engineering and social organization were not independent considerations, but were designed as a single interdependent system. The deeper analysis progresses, the more one unresolved issue becomes impossible to ignore, which is the complete absence of a documented framework explaining how Gadames was designed, as no surviving manuscripts describe its layout, no engineering treatises outline its principles, and no transitional stages demonstrate a gradual evolution from simpler forms. Despite this absence, the city exhibits controlled thermal gradients, integrated airflow systems, material optimization at an urban scale, and spatial organization aligned with environmental forces, all of which typically require formal knowledge systems in other historical contexts. Roman engineering, for example, is documented in the writings of Vitruvius, while Persian hydraulic systems are preserved in detailed records, yet Gadames exists without an equivalent body of theory, creating a gap between observable performance and recorded knowledge that remains unexplained. Gadames does not stand entirely alone, but fits into a broader pattern of ancient constructions that appear more optimized than their technological context would predict, from the precision of Andean stonework to the hydraulic sophistication of the Indus Valley. Yet it differs in a critical aspect, because it does not address a single engineering challenge, but simultaneously resolves multiple environmental constraints, including extreme heat, intense solar radiation, limited water availability, and sand-laden winds. What makes this particularly significant is that these solutions are not isolated innovations, but are integrated into a unified urban system in which every component contributes to overall performance, suggesting a level of systemic thinking that is rarely attributed to pre-industrial societies. Halmaris is located at the edge of the Danube Delta, a region defined not by stability but by constant transformation. Rivers shift, sediments accumulate, land appears and disappears over decades. It is precisely the kind of environment where permanent architecture is expected to fail, and yet Halmaris did not. The site first entered modern historical awareness in the 19th century through scattered references and surface observations, but systematic excavations only began in the late 20th century. Early surveys identified defensive walls, towers, and traces of Roman military occupation. Later excavations revealed far more: a basilica, a crypt, and stratified occupation layers indicating continuous use from the 1st century CE into the Byzantine period. Each campaign added detail, but also deepened the central contradiction this was not a temporary outpost. It was a long-lived, structurally stable settlement built in one of the least stable environments in southeastern Europe. Initial excavations uncovered the fortification system, stone walls several meters thick, reinforced towers, and carefully designed entry points. Subsequent campaigns revealed a Christian basilica constructed in the 4th century, followed by the discovery of a crypt containing 2 skeletons attributed to the martyrs Epictetus and Astian. Later studies identified evidence of water proximity sediment layers, geomorphological patterns, and structural orientation suggesting that Halmaris once had direct access to navigable waterways. Each discovery expanded the site's function, military, religious, and possibly commercial. But none resolved the fundamental problem. How did it persist here at all? The first and most significant mystery lies in its location. Roman engineering was not random. Across the empire, fortresses were strategically placed based on elevation, defensive advantage, and geological stability. Sites like Vindolanda or the forts along Hadrian's Wall were constructed on firm ground, often elevated, minimizing long-term structural risk. Halmaris violates this pattern completely. It sits within a deltaic environment characterized by alluvial soils, fine-grained sediments with high water content, low cohesion, and a well-documented tendency towards subsidence. Modern geotechnical studies show that such soils can shift measurably within decades. Over centuries, the effect compounds dramatically. To quantify this, deltaic subsidence rates in comparable environments can reach several millimeters per year. Over 500 years, that translates into vertical displacement on the order of 1 to 2 meters, more than enough to destabilize stone foundations. And yet, the walls of Halmaris remained intact long enough to support continuous occupation across multiple centuries. There is no surviving documentation describing specialized foundation techniques. No evidence of deep piling systems comparable to later Venetian engineering, and no clear indication of artificial ground stabilization. The archaeological record shows adaptation and repair, but not the kind of foundational innovation required to fully explain such longevity. This creates a structural paradox. Either the Romans employed localized engineering solutions that have left no clear trace, or the environmental conditions during the occupation period were significantly different from those observed today. Paleogeographic studies suggest that the Danube Delta has undergone major shifts over the past 2 millennia, but even reconstructed ancient shorelines do not fully resolve the instability problem. The fortress was still built in a marginal zone, an area where long-term settlement would typically be avoided. What makes this even more unusual is that Roman military planning was typically conservative, favoring predictability over experimentation. Halmaris, by contrast, behaves like an exception that should not exist within that system. The second anomaly concerns the scale and intensity of fortification. Halmaris was not a lightly defended outpost. Its walls, towers, and internal layout indicate a level of military investment comparable to far more strategically critical sites. Yet historically, this region was not the primary axis of major Roman conflicts. Compared to heavily contested frontiers like the Rhine or the main Danube line further west, Halmaris appears overbuilt. Defensive architecture generally reflects threat level. Here, the architecture suggests either a threat that was never recorded or a strategic importance that has been underestimated. The disproportion between location and defensive strength creates a mismatch that remains unresolved. The third layer of complexity emerges with the basilica and the crypt. The transformation of a military site into a religious center is not unusual in late antiquity, but the prominence of the basilica at Halmaris suggests more than routine conversion. The attribution of the remains to Epictetus and Astion is based on later textual traditions rather than direct scientific confirmation. Radiocarbon analysis places the remains within a broadly compatible timeframe, but not with sufficient precision to conclusively verify identity. More importantly, the presence of such a site implies that Halmaris held symbolic or spiritual significance beyond its military function. Why this location, remote, unstable, and marginal, became a focal point for early Christian memory remains unresolved. Another unresolved question involves its relationship to water. Geological and sedimentary evidence indicates that Halmaris was once connected to a navigable branch of the Danube or a nearby lagoon system. If true, this would partially explain its strategic value control over a fluid, shifting water network. However, no intact harbour structures have been definitively identified, and the ancient hydrological configuration remains partly speculative. The delta has reconfigured itself multiple times since antiquity, erasing direct evidence and leaving only indirect traces. This raises the possibility that Halmaris was once far more connected and far more important than its present inland position suggests. Finally, there is the question of abandonment. Many Roman sites show clear signs of violent destruction, economic collapse, or environmental catastrophe. Halmaris does not. The archaeological layers suggest gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. Occupation diminishes, structures fall into disuse, and the site is eventually left behind. There is no single catastrophic event, only a quiet disengagement. This pattern complicates interpretation because it removes the most common explanatory frameworks. Without a clear ending, the site resists being placed into a familiar historical narrative. Taken together, Halmaris does not present a single mystery, but a convergence of them. A fortress built where it should not stand, a structure that persists where it should fail, a defensive system that exceeds apparent necessity, a religious center emerging in an unlikely place, a settlement connected to waterways that no longer exist, and an ending that offers no clear cause. Individually, each of these anomalies might be explained: environmental fluctuation, strategic miscalculation, religious reinterpretation, gradual economic decline. But combined, they form a pattern that resists simple explanation. Halmiris does not contradict Roman engineering. It exposes the limits of what we currently understand about how that engineering was applied in extreme conditions. And that leaves a final question unresolved. If a site like Halmiris could exist, function, and endure for centuries under conditions we consider unsuitable, how many other places have followed the same pattern and simply disappeared without leaving enough evidence behind to challenge our assumptions? Stone is supposed to resist human intention. It fractures, it erodes, it forces compromise. Yet in the high plateau of northern Spain, there exists a place where stone does the opposite. It obeys. Entire homes, stairways, corridors, and hydraulic systems are not built on the land, but carved into it with a level of control that appears strangely deliberate. At Tiames, the question is not simply who built it, but how such precision emerged without leaving behind the process that should have created it. Tiames was known locally for centuries as a ruin embedded in rock, but systematic archaeological study began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with major excavations conducted under Spanish archaeologist Blas Tarracina in the 1920s and 30s. These investigations revealed a settlement with origins traced to the Celtiberians around the 5th century BCE, later expanded under Roman occupation. Excavations uncovered carved residential complexes, a Roman forum, thermal baths, and an extensive network of subterranean structures, all integrated directly into red sandstone bedrock, transforming what initially appeared to be natural erosion into clear evidence of a deliberately engineered urban system. Unlike cities such as Pompeii or Machu Picchu, where materials are assembled layer by layer, Tiames follows an inverse architectural logic, in which space is created by removing matter rather than adding it. Archaeological mapping demonstrates that large portions of the settlement were carved downward and inward from continuous sandstone formations, a method that requires absolute commitment because every cut is irreversible and every error permanent. Yet within Tiames, there are no clear signs of large-scale correction, no abandoned chambers, no misaligned corridors, and no evidence of progressive trial and error. Instead, the spatial organization appears intentional from the outset, with residential rooms typically ranging between 8 and 15 square meters and staircases, maintaining consistent riser heights of approximately 15 to 20 centimeters. This level of uniformity implies not only technical capability but also pre-visualization, suggesting that builders possess the ability to mentally construct and plan complex three-dimensional layouts before executing them directly into stone. Sandstone, the dominant geological material at Tiames, typically measures between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, making it significantly softer than granite and therefore workable with iron tools available during later occupation phases. However, the central issue is not whether the stone could be cut, but how it was cut with such remarkable consistency across large surfaces. Detailed analysis of surviving walls reveals flat planes extending several meters with minimal deviation, parallel tool marks that maintain consistent spacing, and sharply defined internal angles approaching 90 degrees features that imply controlled repetitive motion rather than irregular manual shaping. Experimental archaeology indicates that achieving such precision manually would require not only extensive labor, but also standardized techniques, including consistent tool angles, force application, and measurement systems maintained across time. When compared to Petra, where Nabatean rock-cut architecture visibly preserves irregularities, asymmetries, and layered carving stages, Tiames appears unusually restrained and uniform, suggesting a different operational approach. Even more striking are the staircases, where measurements across multiple excavation zones reveal variations in step height, often remaining within less than 1 centimeter, a tolerance level that implies either a formalized measurement system or an exceptionally disciplined transmission of craftsmanship across generations. Yet no written documentation survives to describe such systems among the Celtiberians, and although Roman engineering could theoretically account for refinement, stratigraphic evidence confirms that some of the most precise carvings predate full Roman integration, creating a persistent gap between expected technological capability and the physical evidence preserved in stone. Beneath the visible structures of Tiames lies a secondary system composed of channels, reservoirs, and conduits carved directly into the bedrock, forming a network that appears neither random nor purely opportunistic. Gradient analysis conducted on preserved water channels demonstrates slopes calibrated with notable consistency, allowing water to flow efficiently without stagnation or destructive erosion, with some inclines maintained steadily across distances exceeding 20 meters. Such precision suggests an applied understanding of fluid behavior, not in abstract theoretical terms, but through repeatable and controlled engineering practice. Comparable hydraulic strategies are documented at Petra, where water collection and distribution systems were essential for survival in arid conditions. Yet Tiames presents a more enigmatic case because it exists in a region where water resources are limited and less predictably available. This creates a paradox. The infrastructure reflects a level of planning appropriate for sustained habitation, yet the surrounding environment does not clearly justify such investment, raising the possibility that Tiames functioned within a broader, now lost system of resource management or regional interaction. Tiames occupies an elevated plateau within the modern province of Soria, characterized by a dry climate, seasonal temperature extremes, and relatively poor agricultural conditions. From a conventional economic or settlement perspective, such a location would not be considered optimal for supporting a large and stable population. Nevertheless, archaeological estimates suggest that during its peak, Tiames may have sustained anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 inhabitants, implying the existence of reliable strategies for water management, food acquisition, and long-term habitation. The carved nature of its architecture may have provided passive thermal regulation, with interior spaces maintaining more stable temperatures than the external environment, representing a sophisticated adaptation to climatic stress. However, what remains difficult to reconcile is the apparent completeness of this adaptation, as there is little evidence of gradual development or incremental improvement, suggesting instead that these solutions appeared already refined at the time they were implemented. In contrast to sites such as Pompeii, where sudden catastrophic events preserved a clear narrative of destruction, Tiames offers no equivalent archaeological signature of abrupt collapse. There are no extensive burn layers, no widespread structural failures, and no mass burial evidence that would indicate a singular crisis event. Instead, the material record points toward a gradual process of depopulation, with artifacts becoming increasingly scarce and signs of maintenance diminishing over time until the settlement was ultimately abandoned. This absence of a defined endpoint complicates interpretation, as it removes the possibility of attributing the city's disappearance to a single identifiable cause, leaving open multiple possibilities ranging from economic shifts to environmental pressures or broader socio-political changes. If a city can exist with this level of precision, yet leave behind no trace of how it was created, what do you think we are missing in our understanding of ancient technology? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Deep within the dense rain-soaked forests of Sri Lanka's southwestern highlands lies Batadomba Lena Cave, a site that, at first glance, appears unremarkable. Just another limestone shelter carved by time and water. Yet beneath its quiet surface, this cave has revealed evidence that challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about early human technology: that complexity evolved slowly and only in certain advanced regions of the prehistoric world. Excavations conducted throughout the late 20th century, most notably under the direction of archaeologist Archaeological, uncovered stratified deposits dating back approximately 36,000 years, firmly placing Batadomba Lena within the late Pleistocene. But it is not the age of the site that has captivated researchers. It is the astonishing sophistication of the tools found within it, particularly a class of artifacts known as microliths, which may represent one of the earliest examples of what could be described metaphorically as nano-engineering in human history. These microliths, often measuring no more than 1 to 3 centimeters in length, are not crude flakes or accidental byproducts of stone knapping. Instead, they exhibit consistent geometric shapes: triangles, crescents, trapezoids, with finely retouched edges and clear signs of deliberate shaping. The production of such tools requires an advanced understanding of fracture mechanics. The napper must control the angle, force, and point of impact with remarkable precision to detach tiny, predictable fragments from a core without shattering the entire piece. Experimental archaeology has shown that even skilled modern practitioners struggle to produce microliths with consistent size and symmetry, particularly when working with the types of raw materials available in tropical environments. And yet, at Batadomba Lena, hundreds, if not thousands, of these tools have been recovered, many displaying a level of standardization that implies not only skill, but a repeatable, possibly taught technique. What makes this even more extraordinary is the chronological context. In Europe, microlithic technologies are generally associated with the Mesolithic period, emerging widely after about 12,000 years ago as human groups adapted to post-glacial environments. And sites such as Hohlfels Cave provide evidence of early symbolic behavior and tool use, but the systematic production of microliths appears significantly later. In contrast, Batadomba Lena presents clear evidence of microlithic technology tens of thousands of years earlier, suggesting either an independent invention or a much earlier origin of this technological strategy than previously believed. Comparisons with Blombos Cave, another key site known for early advanced behavior, including engraved ochre and bone tools dating to around 75,000 years ago, highlight an important distinction. While Blombos demonstrates symbolic and possibly cognitive complexity, Batadomba Lena provides direct evidence of mechanical and functional precision at a miniature scale. The implications of this are profound, and microliths are rarely used alone. Their small size makes them inefficient as standalone tools. Instead, they are typically hafted, embedded into wooden or bone shafts using adhesives such as plant resins or animal glues to form composite tools like arrows, spears, or cutting implements. This means that the inhabitants of Batadomba Lena were not merely shaping stone, they were engineering multi-component systems, combining materials with different properties into a unified functional design. Such composite technology requires planning, foresight, and an understanding of how different elements interact under stress. It is, in essence, a form of systems engineering, appearing tens of thousands of years earlier than many models of human technological evolution would predict. Archaeological layers within the cave also contain faunal remains that support this interpretation. Bones of small, agile arboreal animals, Monkeys, giant squirrels, and various bird species have been identified, indicating that the cave's inhabitants were successfully hunting in a dense tropical rainforest environment. This is significant because such environments present unique challenges: limited visibility, complex terrain, and fast-moving prey that often dwell in the canopy. Traditional large hunting weapons would be impractical here. Instead, lightweight, fast projectiles, potentially tipped with microliths, would offer a clear advantage. While direct evidence of bows has not survived due to the rapid decomposition of organic materials in humid climates, the presence and morphology of the microliths strongly suggest their use in projectile technology. If true, this would push back the timeline for the development of advanced hunting systems by tens of thousands of years. Another layer of complexity emerges when considering the raw materials themselves. Geological analyses have indicated that some of the stone used to produce microliths at Bata Domba does not originate from the immediate vicinity of the cave. Instead, it appears to have been transported from sources located several tens of kilometers away. This raises critical questions about mobility and social interaction. Were these early humans traveling long distances through dense jungle to acquire specific types of stone? Or were they engaged in some form of exchange network with neighboring groups? Either scenario implies a level of spatial awareness, planning, and possibly even social organization that goes beyond the simplistic models often applied to Paleolithic societies. Equally puzzling is the preservation of these artifacts. Tropical environments are notoriously destructive to archaeological materials, especially organic components. High humidity, fluctuating temperatures, and biological activity typically accelerate decay. Yet the microliths at Bata Domba remain remarkably well defined, their edges still sharp, their shapes intact. This suggests that the inhabitants may have been selectively choosing raw materials with superior durability, or that the cave's microenvironment provided unusually stable conditions. Now, some researchers have even speculated, cautiously, that early humans may have possessed empirical knowledge of how different stones weather over time, effectively engaging in a rudimentary form of material science. Despite decades of research, many aspects of Bata Domba remain unresolved. There is no clear consensus on whether the microlithic technology developed here independently or represents part of a broader, yet poorly understood network of technological exchange across prehistoric Asia. Nor is it fully understood how such a high level of precision was achieved without metal tools, advanced measuring instruments, or written knowledge systems. What is clear, however, is that the people who inhabited this cave were not merely surviving. They were innovating, experimenting, and refining techniques in ways that blur the line between primitive and advanced. If humans over 30,000 years ago were already capable of creating nano-level technology like microliths, how much do you think we've underestimated their intelligence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Motilla del Azuer was first systematically excavated in the 1970s in the La Mancha plain of central Spain. Beneath what appeared to be a low circular mound, archaeologists uncovered a multi-layered fortified structure dating to approximately 2,500 BCE during the early to middle Bronze Age. What initially looked like a defensive outpost soon revealed something far more complex, a deep, engineered well at its core, immediately distinguishing it from typical Bronze Age settlements and raising questions about its true purpose from the very beginning. Most early complex societies formed in direct relationship with predictable water sources, where environmental stability allowed agriculture and urban planning to develop gradually over time. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and relied on river systems such as the Indus River and Euphrates River, where seasonal flooding could be anticipated, controlled, and eventually engineered into irrigation networks. Motilla dell'Azua violates this entire model. Located in a semi-arid plateau with no permanent rivers nearby, the site sits in a region where annual rainfall today averages only 300–400 millimeters, and paleoclimate reconstructions indicate that during the 4.2 kiloyear climate event, a global drought phase beginning around 2200 BCE, conditions were even more severe, contributing to societal stress and collapse across regions from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Yet here, instead of abandonment or migration, we see deliberate construction. Rather than moving toward water as nearly every other known civilization did, the inhabitants of Motilla engineered access to it beneath their feet, suggesting a radically different survival strategy that depended not on geography, but on controlled subsurface resources. At the center of the structure lies a well exceeding 16 meters in depth, making it one of the earliest known deep wells in the Iberian Peninsula and one of the most technically demanding features of the entire site. Excavations reveal carefully arranged stone linings that stabilize the shaft and prevent collapse under shifting soil pressures, indicating a level of structural planning far beyond what is typically attributed to early Bronze Age communities in Western Europe. The difficulty is not simply the act of digging, but the precision required to succeed. To access groundwater effectively, ancient builders would have needed to identify a viable aquifer without geological instruments, estimate depth with minimal error, maintain vertical alignment during excavation, and reinforce the shaft in a way that would ensure long-term stability under variable environmental conditions. Modern hydrogeology relies on drilling surveys, resistivity mapping, and stratigraphic analysis to achieve these outcomes, none of which were available at the time. Even more striking is the fact that this was not an isolated success. Multiple motillas across the La Mancha region contain similar wells, implying the existence of a repeatable and reliable method rather than accidental discovery. Statistically, repeatedly striking groundwater at functional depths without a consistent detection strategy would be highly improbable, suggesting that the builders possessed a form of environmental knowledge that has not been preserved in the archaeological record. Whether this knowledge was the result of accumulated empirical observation or a more structured system of understanding remains unresolved. At first glance, Motilla dell'Azua presents itself as a defensive structure, characterized by concentric walls, narrow and controlled access corridors, and a central elevated tower that would typically function as a vantage point or last line of defense. However, a closer functional analysis reveals that the architecture is organized around a different priority entirely. The most protected and structurally reinforced element within the complex is not a military installation or storage facility, but the well itself. This inversion of expected defensive logic is significant. In other ancient systems, such as Petra, water infrastructure was integrated into the urban landscape through channels, reservoirs, and cisterns designed to collect and distribute seasonal rainfall, while in Hattusa, large-scale water storage systems were embedded within a broader administrative and defensive framework. In both examples, water remains accessible and distributed across the settlement. At Motilla, by contrast, water is centralized, enclosed, and heavily controlled, accessible only through the innermost layers of the structure. This suggests not only an advanced understanding of hydraulic necessity, but also a socio-political system in which access to water may have been regulated, possibly reflecting extreme scarcity conditions where groundwater became the most valuable and vulnerable resource. The construction of Motilla dell'Azua relies primarily on locally sourced materials, including uncut or roughly shaped stone, and compacted earth applied through rammed earth techniques with minimal evidence of advanced binding agents or reinforcement technologies. Under typical conditions, such materials are highly susceptible to environmental stressors, including moisture variation, thermal expansion, erosion, and structural fatigue over time. Despite this, significant portions of the structure have remained stable for more than 3,000 years, an outcome that challenges conventional expectations in materials science. Particularly notable is the integrity of the internal walls near the well shaft, where fluctuations in humidity would have been most pronounced. These walls exhibit a degree of cohesion and durability that implies careful selection and preparation of soil composition, precise layering methods to distribute mechanical stress, and potentially even timing of construction phases to align with optimal environmental conditions for curing and stabilization. Such performance characteristics are typically associated with long-term iterative experimentation and gradual refinement. Yet the archaeological record surrounding the Motilla culture does not display a clear sequence of developmental stages or failed attempts leading to this level of engineering efficiency. Instead, the structure appears to embody a mature understanding of material behavior from its earliest phases. Motilla del Azuere is part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated anomaly. More than 30 motillas have been identified across the La Mancha region, each sharing core architectural features such as central wells, concentric fortifications, and strategic placement within the landscape. When analysed spatially, these sites form a loosely distributed network, often positioned at intervals that would allow communication or travel between them within a matter of hours. This distribution suggests the possibility of coordinated planning, shared technical knowledge, or at the very least, a cultural framework in which similar solutions to environmental challenges were independently but consistently implemented. The existence of such a network implies a level of regional organization that goes beyond simple village-level construction. However, unlike the centralized states of Mesopotamia or Egypt, there is no clear evidence of administrative hierarchy, no written documentation, and no monumental inscriptions that would indicate the presence of governing institutions overseeing this system. What emerges instead is a decentralized, yet highly consistent infrastructure, operating with a level of technical coherence that is difficult to reconcile with the absence of visible coordination mechanisms. By approximately 1500 BCE, the Motilla system was abandoned, marking the end of a distinctive and technologically sophisticated phase in the region's prehistory. The nature of this abandonment remains unclear. There is no widespread evidence of violent destruction, no signs of catastrophic collapse, and no clear indicators of sudden external disruption. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests a gradual process of desertion. Several explanations have been proposed, including climatic recovery that may have reduced dependence on deep groundwater extraction, overuse of aquifers leading to declining water tables, or broader social and demographic transformations that altered settlement patterns. However, none of these hypotheses fully account for the disappearance of a system that appears to have been both effective and resilient under extreme environmental conditions. Unlike many ancient technologies that evolve into more advanced or adapted forms, the Motilla system does not demonstrate a clear trajectory of development or integration into later cultures. It emerges, functions at a high level of efficiency, and then ceases without a direct successor, leaving behind a gap in the historical narrative. What do you think? Was this the result of lost empirical knowledge, or evidence of a level of environmental engineering we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On the shifting edge of the Danube, near modern Iserkea, a Roman fortress once rose on ground that behaves less like land and more like a slow-moving system. Fine sediments, seasonal flooding, Lateral river migration, this is not where long-term military infrastructure is supposed to survive. And yet, for centuries, Novia Dunum did not just exist. It held. What makes Novia Dunum unusual is not its identity as a Roman stronghold, but the quiet contradiction embedded in its foundation. Because everything we understand about ancient engineering suggests that structures of this scale, defensive walls several meters thick, harbor installations, storage complexes, require predictability beneath them. Stability, resistance. The Danube floodplain offers none of these, and that is where the anomaly begins. Geologically, the lower Danube basin is composed largely of alluvial deposits, layers of sand, silt, and clay laid down over thousands of years. These materials compress under load, shift with water saturation, and erode under lateral flow. Modern civil engineering treats such environments as high-risk zones. Large constructions require deep piling, soil stabilization, or relocation to firmer ground. Roman engineers were not unaware of this. In places like Colosseum or Pont du Gard, foundations were carefully adapted to terrain, often using layered stone, pozzolanic concrete, and drainage systems to control moisture and load distribution. Even riverine constructions, such as bridges along the Rhine, were anchored into more stable substrates. But at Novia Dunum, the archaeological record suggests something different. Excavations indicate that massive defensive walls, likely exceeding 2 to 3 meters in thickness, were erected directly on floodplain soil. No clear evidence of deep foundational pilings has been consistently identified. No extensive substructures comparable to those used in other Roman sites appear in the surviving data. And yet, structural collapse does not dominate the site's history. This raises a contradiction. If the soil behaves as expected, the fortress should have experienced progressive subsidence, cracking, and eventual structural failure within decades, perhaps a century at most. Instead, Novia Dunum remained operational from at least the 1st century CE into the Byzantine period, spanning several hundred years. One possible explanation is that the Romans employed ground preparation techniques that are either not preserved or not yet recognized. Compacted gravel layers, timber mats, or drainage channels could have redistributed load and reduced water retention. However, the scale required to stabilize an entire fortress of this size would have been immense, and the archaeological footprint of such interventions remains incomplete. Another possibility is more unsettling, that the environmental conditions of the Danube at the time of construction were significantly different. River channels migrate over centuries. Sediment deposition patterns shift. What is unstable today may have been relatively firm in the past. Yet paleo-environmental reconstructions suggest that while local variations existed, the broader floodplain dynamics were already active during the Roman era. So the question remains unresolved. Not how the fortress was built, but how it endured. Most long-lived settlements tell a story of gradual adaptation. Materials improve, techniques evolve, repairs become visible as distinct phases. At sites like Pompeii, stratigraphy reveals a clear sequence, each layer reflecting a step in technological or cultural change. Novia Dunum complicates this expectation. Here, layers exist, but the transitions between them do not always follow a linear progression. In some sectors, finely cut stonework appears abruptly, adjacent to more irregular masonry. Certain walls exhibit construction precision that aligns with advanced Roman techniques, while nearby structures suggest more expedient or localized methods. The inconsistency is not total, but it is persistent enough to disrupt the assumption of continuous development. This opens multiple interpretations. The site may have hosted different construction teams with varying levels of expertise. Periods of rapid rebuilding, perhaps after damage or strategic shifts, could have introduced abrupt changes in quality. Alternatively, materials may have been reused, creating a patchwork of styles that masks an underlying continuity. Yet even these explanations do not fully resolve the pattern, because the distribution of these variations does not always align neatly with known historical phases. It is as if the technological narrative of the site has been partially erased, leaving behind fragments that no longer connect in a straightforward way. Novio Dunum was more than a fortress. It functioned as a naval base for the Roman fleet on the Danube, the Classis Flavia Moesica. This implies the presence of docking facilities, storage areas, and access points designed for repeated use. However, when modern researchers examine the relationship between the site and the river, inconsistencies emerge. Some structures associated with the harbour appear positioned in zones where current flow is strong, increasing the difficulty of stable docking. Other areas that would be more suitable for anchorage show less architectural investment. Additionally, geomorphological studies indicate that the Danube's course in this region has shifted over time, altering the relationship between land and water. This leads to a critical uncertainty. Were these structures optimally placed at the time of construction, only to be rendered impractical by later environmental change? Or were they designed according to criteria that differ from our assumptions about Roman naval logistics? Comparisons with other river ports, such as those along the Rhine or in the eastern provinces, generally show alignment between infrastructure and hydrodynamic conditions. Novia Dunum does not always conform to this pattern, and without a precise reconstruction of the ancient river channel, the original logic of the harbour remains partially obscured. Many Roman fortresses end with clarity: destruction layers, burn marks, weapon deposits, evidence of conflict that explains their abandonment. Others decline gradually but leave textual or material records that trace their final phases. Novio Dunum offers neither in a complete form. Its occupation extends into the Byzantine period, suggesting continued strategic relevance. Yet at some point, activity diminishes, and the site fades from prominence. There is no single catastrophic layer that marks its end. No definitive record of conquest or deliberate destruction tied directly to its final abandonment. Instead, it appears to have been left behind. This is particularly difficult to reconcile with its location. Positioned along a major artery of movement and trade, controlling access along the Danube frontier, Novia Dunum should have retained value. Even if damaged, such a site would typically be repaired, repurposed, or replaced, unless the conditions that made it valuable changed in ways that are not fully captured in the surviving record. What makes Novia Dunum unusual is not a single mystery, but the accumulation of mismatches. A fortress built on unstable ground yet enduring for centuries, structural layers without a clear progression, a harbour that does not fully align with its environment, and an ending with no definitive explanation. More importantly, the data surrounding it is incomplete. Compared to similar Roman sites, Novia Dunum lacks sufficient records to fully explain how it was built or operated. As a result, it exists in a state between known and understood. Not an impossible technology, but a case where the frameworks we use to interpret history begin to diverge. Each piece makes sense on its own, yet the full picture remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery, not that it cannot be explained, but that it almost fits and then doesn't. So what do you think? Was Novia Dunum simply misunderstood? Or are we missing a piece of history that was never recorded? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Perched above the windswept coastline of southern Africa, Blombos Cave has quietly forced archaeologists to confront a deeply unsettling possibility. That complex technological thinking, once believed to belong to relatively recent civilizations, may have emerged tens of thousands of years earlier than expected. only to vanish and reappear much later in human history. Discovered in the early 1990s and extensively excavated beginning in 1991 under the direction of archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood, the cave has yielded a series of findings dated between approximately 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, pushing the boundaries of what is considered possible for early Homo sapiens. Among its most astonishing discoveries are engraved ochre fragments bearing deliberate geometric patterns, and are carefully perforated shell beads likely used as personal ornaments, and, most controversially, what appears to be a fully developed ochre processing workshop, a system so methodical that many researchers now describe it as one of the earliest known examples of chemical technology. At the center of this mystery lies a set of artifacts uncovered in layers dated to roughly 100,000 years ago. 2 abalone shells used as containers, each containing a reddish compound composed of finely ground ochre mixed with crushed bone, charcoal, and a liquid medium believed to be animal fat or marrow. Accompanying these were hammerstones, grindstones, and bone tools stained with pigment, suggesting not a random accumulation of materials but a deliberate multi-step production process. What makes this discovery extraordinary is not merely the presence of pigment. After all, ochre use has been documented in other Middle Stone Age sites, but the clear evidence of systematic preparation. The ochre was not simply collected and applied, it was processed, combined with other substances, and stored for later use. This implies a level of planning, material knowledge, and procedural consistency that resembles a primitive form of chemical engineering. To understand how unusual this is, it is essential to compare Blombus Cave with other known archaeological contexts. In many early human sites, ochre appears as isolated fragments, often showing signs of scraping or grinding, suggesting its use as a colouring agent or symbolic material. However, these instances rarely demonstrate the full chaîne opératoire, the complete operational sequence, from raw material acquisition to final product storage. At Blombos, by contrast, researchers identified a coherent toolkit and spatial organisation that together indicate a structured production system. The presence of abalone shells as mixing vessels is particularly significant. These shells, with their natural concave shape and durability, functioned effectively as containers, allowing for the mixing and preservation of the pigment mixture. This is not an improvised solution. It reflects an understanding of material properties and functional design. Even more striking is the composition of the pigment itself. Experimental archaeology has shown that combining ochre with fat or marrow creates a more stable and adhesive substance, suitable for application to skin, objects, or possibly cave surfaces. The addition of crushed bone may have altered the texture or consistency, while charcoal could have influenced the colour or chemical behaviour of the mixture. Such combinations suggest that the inhabitants of Blombos Cave were not merely using natural resources, but actively modifying them to achieve desired outcomes. This is a hallmark of technological behaviour, one that requires not only manual skill, but also cognitive abilities such as foresight, experimentation, and the transmission of knowledge across individuals or generations. When placed within a broader timeline, the implications become even more profound. Comparable evidence of pigment processing and storage does not appear again in the archaeological record until much later periods, and particularly during the Upper Paleolithic, around 40,000 years ago, when cave art flourished in Europe. Even then, while pigment preparation is evident, the level of organisation seen at Blombos remains exceptional. If we look further ahead to ancient civilizations such as Egypt, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, we find highly sophisticated pigment technologies, including the production of Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment requiring controlled heating and precise chemical ratios. Yet the gap between Blombos and these later developments spans tens of thousands of years, raising a critical question. Why does such an advanced system appear so early? And why is there so little evidence of its continuous development? Excavations conducted between 1991 and 2011 have reinforced the interpretation of Blombos as a site of repeated, organized activity rather than a one-time occupation. Stratigraphic analysis reveals multiple occupation layers, each containing variations of similar tools and materials, suggesting that the pigment production process was not an isolated experiment, but a recurring practice. Radiometric dating techniques, including optically stimulated luminescence, have consistently placed these activities within the same general time frame, lending credibility to the notion that this technological behavior persisted over generations. Furthermore, microscopic analysis of the tools has identified where patterns consistent with grinding and mixing, while residue analysis confirms the presence of ochre-based compounds. Despite this wealth of evidence, significant questions remain unresolved. One of the most puzzling aspects is the purpose of the pigment. While it is often assumed that ochre was used for symbolic or decorative purposes, such as body painting or ritual marking, there is no direct evidence linking the Blombos mixture to specific applications. Could it have been used as an adhesive, perhaps in tool making or hafting? Some researchers have proposed this possibility, noting that ochre-based compounds can enhance the binding properties of natural glues. However, the exact formulation found at Blombos does not perfectly match known adhesive recipes, leaving the question open. Alternatively, the pigment may have served multiple functions, indeed combining practical and symbolic roles in ways that are difficult to disentangle. Another unresolved issue concerns the origin of the knowledge required to produce such mixtures. The process involves several steps: selecting appropriate raw materials, grinding them to the correct consistency, combining them in specific proportions, and storing the result in suitable containers. Each of these steps requires not only individual skill, but also an understanding of cause and effect, knowledge that must have been acquired through repeated experimentation or passed down through social learning. Yet the archaeological record offers little insight into how this knowledge was developed or transmitted. There are no written records, no direct evidence of teaching, and no clear evolutionary pathway leading to this level of sophistication. This has led some scholars to propose that Blombos represents a localized innovation hotspot, where unique environmental or social conditions allowed for a temporary leap in technological complexity. The comparison with other Middle Stone Age sites further highlights the uniqueness of Blombos. Sites such as Pinnacle Point, also in South Africa, show evidence of early ochre use and heat treatment of stone tools, indicating advanced cognitive behavior. However, even in these contexts, the kind of integrated multi-component production system seen at Blombos is rare. In Europe and Asia, similar developments appear much later, often associated with the spread of modern humans and the emergence of symbolic culture. This raises the possibility that the behaviors observed at Blombos were not widely shared or did not persist long enough to influence broader human populations. What do you think? Was the paint workshop at Blombos Cave a forgotten breakthrough, or evidence of an ancient knowledge system we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below,